All right, Conquest, the last argument of Kings Q2 2026 update is on its way. I've been given an advance copy by the Parabellum devs. Thank you guys very much for sharing that. And with the expectation that this video will be recorded not very long indeed before the actual patch goes live, let's do a read through and first impressions video. Now, what that means is that we are literally just going to be going through the patch notes as they've been sent to me. It's a single consolidated PDF changelog. And we're literally just going to be going through, taking a look at all of it, and giving our first impressions. If you would like a more structured overview, rundown, general impressions, and predictions around what the next state of the meta for Conquest might look like, I would encourage you to take a look at the Goonhammer article that I will be writing to accompany this, which will be based in part on these first impressions, and which will probably also go live relatively shortly after the patch notes are up. So again, with a quick note, and thank you once again to the Parabellum devs for providing this a little bit in advance of the patch dropping, let's jump into Conquest's March 2026 update and take a look at what's changing about the game. Alright, general rules changes first before we jump into different factions, and there are a few things here that are pretty significant from the looks of it. So from the top, just on this page, Aura of Death. Aura of Death is changing, effectively reverting back to how old Aura of Death worked. Now you will sum up the total Aura of Death of the stands in contact with you. Each stand has an individual Aura of Death values. From looking ahead, I know that there are some factions that are going to benefit from this. Dweghom, for example, I know will have some regiments that are going to like this change. Magma Forged, for example, I think are Aura of Death 3 now, which means 3 Magma Forged in contact with you will deal 9 hits. The rule otherwise looks basically unchanged. Other than that, they've got a lower maximum than they used to. I think we had a soft maximum of Aura of Death 5 imposed by things like spells and stuff that could grant the abilities. Now there's a hard-coded maximum of Aura of Death 4. I don't know what can get that. I haven't looked that deeply into it, but okay, solid. This is a very significant buff for regiments that were previously rendered. The Aura of Death change was one of those ones that was like, oh hey, this rule can be a little bit of a negative play experience where you'd have a regiment activate, you'd be like, well, what can I do? You're engaging me, I just take all of these hits. And yes, in practice, actually, there were lots of things that you could do, but the sense of lack of agency caused them to like nerf and nerf and nerf this rule. This is a winding back of that. I don't know if I have like a strong positive or negative opinion about that, but it will absolutely incentivize me to look at ways to get this into my lists, except that none of the factions I play have access to Aura of Death anymore. But if I played those factions, I would be looking at this. Next one is a flank or rear penalty, where rear attacks are a real bastard now. There are design notes that you can see throughout here. And the design notes make the very realistic case that often you didn't want to make rear attacks on regiments. If you make a flank attack on a regiment, most of the time regiments are wider than they are deep, so very often, if you had the choice, you'd make a flank attack because it keeps you closer to your own support and puts you in contact with less of the enemy, while usually still maximizing your own contact. Like if you think about 2 4-wide, 2 deep regiments engaging one another, if one of those hits the flank of the other, they've still got all 4 of their stands in contact, but only 2 of the enemy are in contact. It's a bastard for the enemy to do things like reforms, etc. And it was previously the same penalty. Now it's not, and holy shit, a rear attack is really bad. No, as before, a flank attack causes the enemy to re-roll any successful morale tests. A rear attack now causes everything to automatically fail, which is very significant, particularly on high resolve regiments. There's a note, Indomitable still applies. Yep, cool, that's nice. This can push through a lot of additional damage in those very rare occasions where attacks in the rear occur. Now, I will just point out, there's a little bit of a diction thing here. These don't give us the actual changes that are occurring to the wording in the rules. There's not really such thing as an attack in Conquest. There are clashes and volleys and spells and impacts. Impacts are called impact attacks. But otherwise, the word attack is a little bit nebulous. So I will be curious to see if they shift any of the verbiage around this. But this is a potentially very impactful change. on those rare occasions when it comes up. This is going to be one I think people will forget about for a little while until the first time it materializes, and then be like, oh yeah, that was really bad. Some small changes to Iron Discipline just to reflect the changes that now exist with regards to rear attacks. Condensed Propellant is getting a name change. Good, because it was very silly that a trebuchet had condensed propellant. Longshot is nice and generic. Condensed Propellant obviously emerged as a rule the first time it appeared was on chariots. They're using it elsewhere now. Cool, now it's called Longshot, no problem. And then Combat Reform. Combat Reform has been made easier to do because there were times where it was impossible to make a Combat Reform to get in like face toward enemy. I would actually be a fan of making regular reforms easier to do. In my experience, regular reforms have a whole bunch of steps that you push through to get to the same basic change in formation. I probably have some very limited concerns about this causing confusion if it isn't resolved in the same way as a regular reform, but broadly making reforms easier. I am a fan of friction in Conquest rules, like the game imposing limitations on how players can move, etc., because that's what makes a rank and flank and maneuver in a rank and flank important. But reforms and combat reforms are a little bit too laborious presently. Sure, makes it easier. Excellent. Moving on now, page 2 of general rules changes. There's a lot of these, that's probably good. Down the left, loose formation, just a syntax change, making it very clear that you can't inflict impact attacks. Yep, fine. Wound allocation, with stands, you have to now start with the stand furthest from the command stand when picking a stand to allocate wounds to. I think in practice that was kind of required most of the time anyway. They've said they might make some further changes to this. Yep, no problem. That shouldn't impact how most people play. Big question, big asterisk change to charges. How you interact with charges, how you perform charges remains the same. When you are a monster, when you are a regiment or a regiment with a single stand, most of the time that's monsters, you now have to align as much of your stand as possible against the charge target. This is really significant for monsters charging monsters. I've had a lot of games where you're able to meet the requirement to maximize stand contact and just be corner to corner touching. Now it's like, no, the monster has to charge the enemy monster and be fully aligned, which is intuitive with how the rules tell you to play. Totally fine. It certainly removes a little bit of agency that monster players have, but that's good. Monsters are too easy to use. So, yep, no problem. A couple of other new rules that are relevant. Below starting strength is just a way of triggering other abilities. There's a few things we'll see that will interact with this. You are below starting strength if you have suffered any wounds or lost any stands. Yep, cool, no problem. That means what we would think it means, and there'll be some things like berserk abilities and stuff that will interact with that. New rule, Fury. Upon completing a successful charge, the regiment adds +1 to its attacks characteristic until the end of the round. This is not a massive rule, like a regiment that gets Fury isn't like, oh wow, well it's got Fury, but that isn't an insignificant buff to many regiments' offensive output. We're going to see it, for example, on Crimson Tower in the 100 Kingdoms, really reinforcing that it's like, no, this is a regiment that you want to do lots of charges with, charge clashes if you can. Yep, cool, that'll be interesting to see. More new rules. Brittle. This is a very significant one. This is one that has been rolled around for ages. It was never exactly clear what Brittle would do, different things, different proposals, etc. But the idea always was a rule that Old Dominion have that make them respect flank or rear charges. So Brittle now exists in the game. Old Dominion players, don't fret too much. We've looked ahead. There is a lot of changes coming to Old Dominion. It's effectively a full faction rework. What does Brittle do? A regiment with Brittle that makes defense rolls as a result of a clash or charge, not volley, to note, or spells, in its flank or rear. In the flank, treats 2 successful rolls as failures. In the rear, 4 successful rolls as failures. So it's effectively Tenacious -2 and Tenacious -4. That is pretty significant. An Old Dominion regiment copying hits in the rear probably will still take less damage than a regiment with a resolve statistic. But this rule is going to be a big deal, and we'll want to keep it in mind when we get to Old Dominion. Rage. Hey, here's the first use of below starting strength. A regiment with Rage that is below starting strength gets +1 clash and attack. Those are big bonuses. And there's a dev note that we'll see that on Berserk, so it'll be interesting to see how Berserks look with this new rule. Trial of Will effectively allows regiments, when they perform clashes, to force the enemy to use resolve rather than defense or evasion. A lot of the time, even with Terror does apply to that. Terror reduces the the resolve in this case, which you'd be testing against, a lot of the time regiments will have a higher resolve than they will defense. So I don't know how much of a big deal as that is, but on a defense 3 resolve 3 regiment that isn't benefiting from, say, a size bonus to their resolve, that's as good as cleave 1. And there could be some cases where that's a very big deal. Up next, we've got some terrain changes, although as far as I can tell, the only significant change is that obscuring terrain is now called cover, terrain that grants cover. So a forest, for example, will be traversable, size something, hindering, and cover. Yep, I mean, language changes are a little bit tricky to get into our heads. We'll have to get used to calling forests cover. That's a sensible enough name. They've also removed broken ground from the rules, which I guess is technically, I was going to say technically buffed to cavalry because broken ground tended to screw cavalry, but actually no, dangerous also does the double wounds to cavalry. So, okay, we tended to use broken ground a lot because there was a lot of times where you're like, dangerous is a real pain in the ass, but let's just add a little bit here that's a little bit of a disincentive to move through. I didn't mind having like a little bit of lower impact terrain occasionally, and broken ground was an option. Okay, it doesn't exist anymore, just use dangerous. Sure, that's fine. There's also noted some changes to arcing fire to clarify interaction with rear attacks. I have no idea how that change clarifies the interaction with rear attacks. I don't know how arcing fire interacts with rear attacks, so that one's a weird one to me. Someone else will have to figure that out. Overall impressions of the general rules changes is significant. Obviously, some of it's just, semantic changes, but the aura of death change is a really big deal. The flank and rear penalties are a big deal. And brittle when we get to Old Dominion is going to be a big deal. New rules to add to regiments is also kind of cool, but I guess we'll have to look and see the impact of those when we jump on into factions to see how those changes are actually applied in practice. Okay, so into the factions and 100 Kingdoms first. Mostly nerfs here, I think we will find. I don't think I disagree with many of them from a design perspective. And look, frankly, some of these have probably been coming for some time. They will be things to bear in mind if you're a 100 Kingdoms player or 100 Kingdoms play against you relatively regularly. So first change is to rapid deployment. This is the Imperial Subfaction special rule. Previously, it gave Vanguard to 2 Imperial Infantry regiments. Now you can pick 2 Imperial Infantry or 1 non-Imperial Infantry. This is really only significantly relevant in a Theist Imperial alliance, because in Feudal Imperial you'll almost always have all of your regiments be Imperial because of the Feudal Dynastic Alliance bonus, and in Order Imperial there are no Orders Infantry. There probably will be eventually. We know Order of the Sword is probably coming at some point, but this does allow you to give Vanguard to things like Sicarii and Crusaders, which is pretty significant for the playability of Theist Imperial as an alliance in particular. However, accompanying that is a nerf. The free reform on veteran infantry regiments has been significantly reduced back down to fluid formation. This is a very, very significant change. You still keep opportunist. Opportunist is a good rule. There is an enormous difference between a free reform and fluid formation. Fluid formation is limited to being 3 wide. It is very constraining. It can only happen at the beginning and the end of your activation, so you can't, for example, move reform charge. And the main difference, of course, is that the massive threat ranges you could get off of Imperial regiments, you could do things like have Hunter Cadre 5 wide, and they might shoot for a turn or two, and then on the Imperial Supremacy turn, do a massive reform where they fling the corner of that regiment forward, gap close 5 or 6 inches, then make a charge that's effectively, it's as good as having a charge 12 plus d6 rerollable. That's gone now. That's going to be a really big deal for the effectiveness of any Imperial Alliance army. It's going to significantly reduce the threat ranges you got from the supremacy. It is not unexpected because fluid formation was changed, because most of the player base could never really get their heads around the effect that that free reform had on charge threat extension, and the Imperial Supremacy was the only holdout that still had the charge threat extension at its maximum potential. I'm not surprised to see this change. It is definitely a nerf overall to the Imperial Supremacy, so hey, if you were an Imperial Theist player, you're going to have to figure out what your faction, like what your formations look like now. I would previously have run Sicarii, for example, and I would have run them relatively wide. But if you want to benefit from fluid formation on the Supremacy turn, you've got to run them very narrow now, and that just may not be worthwhile. So maybe Imperial becomes more of an MSU kind of subfaction where you run lots of small regiments. I kind of did that already. I'm not sure what Imperial lists look like now because that is a very significant restriction. Next change, Noble Lord down to 105 points. Good, he was grotesquely expensive. Remember how he used to cost 130? That was a fucking ripoff. At 105, he is probably reasonably costed. That is still much more expensive than a Foot Noble Lord, but you do get some resiliency for that. You're a worse combatant, but you get impact attacks. So this is a very welcome change. Armor of Dominion increased by 20 points, up to 50 now. Again, probably not unreasonable. I don't usually take this armor much myself because 30 points was quite expensive and Hardened 1 isn't too hard to find in 100 Kingdoms. But if you compare this to similar artifacts that exist in places like Dweghom, for example, it's pretty comparable. People complained a lot about the Dweghom artifact that prevented their defense from ever being reduced below 3, and Armor of Dominion was just a better version of that, and it's still a better version of that. It's just comparably costed now. Tip of the Lance, that's the one I think that gives Wedge down to 25 points. That's probably reasonably playable. I would consider taking that on like a Sealed Temple Priory Commander in a unit of Sealed Temple, for example, now. Too expensive before. Next change, Imperial Ranger Corps, the cost of making them veteran is reduced to 10 points from 15. Still too expensive, it's a crap veterancy. And Imperial Ranger Corps generally are a regiment that has had the crap belted out of them by successive changes to core rules around them. They really suffered from the loss of fluid formation. Acute senses is not a comparable rule. This doesn't hurt them, but it's not going to make them particularly playable. They're a fine enough ranged regiment, but it doesn't really move the needle on them at all. More small changes, the Hunter Cadre Null Mage is reduced to 10 points from 20. I know some people who took that already. For me, at 10 points, that's not unattractive. There are cases like meta cases where you might take that now. I would give that some consideration. I probably wouldn't have previously, or I know I didn't previously. 20 points was too expensive. 10 points is more appealing to me. Okay, cool, happy with that. Longbowman, now down to range 20 from 22, but only 130 points. Range is probably one of the most important stats you can have on a regiment, but 10 points isn't unreasonable in terms of that reduction. And there are some notes. This is not the only regiment that's going to have had its range reduced. Kind of everything is seeing a slow drift downward in ranges. Stuff that was 18 is now 16. Some things in the game that were 14 are now 12. Spires update, for example. And so in comparison to everything else, 20 is still pretty far. And kind of most importantly, 20 is at that range. 20 is actually one of the few regiments. I think longbows are the only regiment with that far of a range these days. 20 is far enough that your opponent is going to struggle even to march charge you, which is a big deal for a ranged regiment. Also a big deal for a ranged regiment, Militia Bowmen. 10 points cost increase. 2 points range reduction. Huh, that seems really bad. Oh wait, their volley just doubled. Now, okay, it doubled to 2, but that's a very weird one because militia bowmen were kind of like a joke regiment that you took because they were 80 points. You needed a mainstay, you needed somewhere to put a theist priest. They were the cheapest regiment in the game. They were expected to do nothing. Now they are actually still tied for the cheapest regiment in the game alongside Force-Grown Drones. But at volley 2, aiming up to 3, they might actually do something sometimes in a way that's not like a moment of celebration when it occurs, but actually just, oh yeah, they inflicted 5 hits because they aimed and that did some wounds. This tickles my brain a little bit. I'm interested about this. I'm going to have to try these guys out. I am pretty sure mathematically that the relationship between militia bowmen into mercenary crossbows, into ranger corps, into longbowmen really is just like a linear increase in damage. Like it's just the points get you what you pay for across all of those, which is probably good because you want them all to be approximately balanced, even if they're all functionally the same kind of regiment. That is an interesting change. Like I said, tickles my brain. Household Guard, 10 points less. Yep, fine. Order of the Crimson Tower, gain Fury. This is interesting, and it kind of cements Order of the Crimson Tower as a regiment that wants to be making charge clashes if it at all can, and can make march charges as a consolation prize. People, I think, will probably still continue to get that wrong, but if you can set up a Crimson Tower charge, that's really significant. My reading of Fury is that it will work on attached characters. In fact, most of the 100 Kingdoms, or most of the rules, like Wedge and their impact attack rule, also work on attached characters. I have been wanting to try out for a while a Crimson Tower Priory Commander in Crimson Tower. This is a good push to do so. Crimson Tower needed something. They were still not quite worthwhile relative to their cost. Maybe this does it. We'll have to see. Trebuchet added as a new regiment. I suspect the Trebuchet is not very good, and I am glad the Trebuchet is not very good, because we don't want siege weapons to be dominant. We want them to be splash regiments, sometimes pieces in an army that people take because they think the model is cool, not competitively dominant. Things get very bad when things like siege weapons are competitively dominant in rank and flank. I suspect that they've conservatively balanced it. It's its whole new regiment, 30-inch range, sits on the backfield, relatively limited damage output. Sure, fine. I will play with it at some point relatively soon. Not sure if I will buy a regiment. Probably won't, actually. It's not cheap. But you can go and look at that regiment yourself. I'm not going to do a whole ton of commentary on it. Finally, in terms of little points changes, men-at-arms per stand cost increase up to 35 from 30. This makes me very sad personally, but is totally reasonable. I have run quite a few lists that make really significant use of very large numbers of outsized men-at-arms regiments. It was very efficient. You can stack tons of force multipliers on them, particularly in Theist feudal lists. You can still do that. Those lists will be a little more expensive now. Again, this is a nerf to me personally, and I will take it personally as a result, but it's pretty reasonable. Spell changes, there are some spells that you won't often cast that have increased to range 12, otherwise this is just a bunch of syntax changes. And with that, on to Spires. Let's keep moving at a solid clip. Not a ton of changes here, kind of to be expected, because this faction was only recently reworked. There have been a lot of people expressing a lot of opinions that Spires is missing this or needs this, or etc. And honestly, not many of those are particularly wrong. But the faction rework was released in January. We're not getting a rework in March. These are some small changes. They are mostly welcome. Let's walk through them. Field studies, that's the Biomancers from a sea. Now you can have 4 rather than 3 Biomancy tokens. I got used to spending these very, very quickly as they accrued, because you did tend to find that 3, you would just be like, oh, there were a whole bunch of regiments that died this turn, and because of how you spend them during Biomancy activations, and then when you're doing strains, you could often have situations where you'd be like, didn't really have a window to spend any, guess I wasted them. That was, once you got used to playing with Biomancer supremacies, that became relatively rare. I think at West Coast War, I didn't have many occasions where I was having field studies tokens pass me by and not be spent. They're not a huge deal in any case. This is a good change. Lets you stockpile a few more. Yep, fine. Lambs to the slaughter. This is the lineage highborn supremacy. I think she gives Fearless to a regiment that she's attached to already. Now she also gives Fury. Now she is almost always going to be attached to an Unstoppable Seed 6 regiment, which is okay at getting the charge, but not fantastic, but it's still a little buff. The activated thing is the same. Sovereign Lineage. Magnanimity. This now it's clarified as below starting strength rather than if they have any wounds. This is still garbage. You should never ever pick Sovereign Lineage, except in the rarest of cases when you're building a list. You should pretty much always be picking Underspires generally and Directorate in some niche cases. This is just a clarification change. Remorseless Hunters, also just a clarification change, gains the Longsword Special rule. If you want to build a Remorseless Hunters army, if you want to build a Lineage Prideborn Warlord, it's very fun. It's not very good, but it's quite fun. It's worth playing once if you have the models. Now, the change to designate target actually is pretty significant. It's noted in the designer notes as a small buff, but actually being able to shoot into melee and then allow regiments in that melee to reroll misses during a clash is much more significant than reroll misses during a charge. Yes, you often clash following a charge, but you didn't get rerolls on that, and more importantly, in a static grind, supporting fire, like this is actually a really big deal. You could have even a regiment of like a big regiment of force-grown drones. No, and I've actually just read the rule properly. You still have to perform a charge. Now it just, okay, this is actually a small buff. Fair enough. Okay, if you perform a charge, you get to re-roll your attacks during the charge and the clash afterwards if you make a clash. Okay, actually, okay, fine. It is a small buff. It's not a particularly big deal. Probably more significant is the Mimetic Assassin. One of the things that we figured out post-release is that Mimetic Assassin does not, or didn't, and still doesn't, benefit from the Inspire special rule when it appears. That's because it wasn't in the regiment. So when a regiment performs, for example, an Inspire clash, the Mimetic Assassin only pops out of the regiment during the clash. He wasn't present when they prepared when they declared the Inspire. Similarly, wouldn't have been present when they declared a charge. There was no way to inspire a Mimetic Assassin previously, which is actually a pretty big deal. even for a Clash 3 Flurry regiment. Now he just has Inspired. Cool, now he gets Inspired. Lovely. There are some clarification changes here. The other useful change is the Resolve characteristic. Resolve characteristic changed to no Resolve stat from 1. That's actually a really big deal, because if you put a Mimetic Assassin in a regiment and the regiment broke, they had to use the lowest resolve in the regiment. And when he was 1, that meant that his presence just nuked the regiment's resolve if they broke. It meant that a break would almost always result in a shatter. Now, he doesn't do that. Really happy with that change, because that was very dumb. Otherwise, there's just a clarification here about how you can't. Again, previously, rules as written, there was an argument that you could use the Mimetic Assassin's ability to appear in regiments to respawn or jump between regiments. Was not intended to do that. No one played it that way. Now it's nice and clear. This is not a buff, really, to the Mimetic Assassin. This is fixing the rules. This is the oh, okay, we figured out some gaps in the rules. Now they work well. Yep, cool. Go back to putting Mimetic Assassins in your lists. Lineage Highborn, 130 points, still very expensive. Lineage Prideborn, 120, still very expensive. Neither of those changes hurt, and I'm not against incremental changes. We'll look forward in, 3-4 months' time. Maybe there'll be some more small changes. Maybe there won't. Maybe Spires will be performing just fine. Very possible given other changes that are being made. Slightly larger change, Catabolic Node, 20 points. Good, 30 points is way too expensive, 20 points is playable. Possibly another very big change. Degenerative Aura. Now, Degenerative Aura, if you suffer wounds from decay, the enemy regiment you're currently engaged with immediately suffers X wounds, where X is equal to the number of stands in that regiment. Useless against monsters, because it will be 1 wound. This is potentially an absolute ball ache. This, against a 5 or 6 stand regiment, this will just do 5 or 6 wounds. And it doesn't say that those wounds don't cause resolve. This would happen at the end of an activation. So effectively, if you strain and you take wounds from decay, so if you're a Biomancer, Warlord, etc., bear that in mind, turning off decay will turn off this ability. If you're a Ferromancer, Warlord, and you don't take decay from straining, that will turn off this ability. This is a rule that could actually be kind of okay. Not sure if it's great, because there's really no way to avoid suffering. You'll take 4 wounds minimum most of the time if you have an MSU with a Bio or Ferromancer attached, but you could do a bunch of damage to your opponent. I don't know if I will play this, but there's someone out there who will, and they'll like it. Last 2 pages of Spires changes. Onslaught drones, 130 points down from 135, unstoppable. They are still fragile as hell and don't do very much damage and are way too expensive, but this is an improvement. Again, incremental changes. Lean and Avatara, 170 points. They still have a fragility issue, but this is a little better. I also like that 170 is just a slight, it's a meaningful difference. There are a bunch of 180 point, or there are competing 180 point regiments. Now it's oh, I can fit Leonine Avatara in when I couldn't fit a Terraphon, because I wanted an Evasion 2 regiment that dies to a stiff breeze. How could I decide? Now you get that little point of differentiation. Oh, I've got 10 points spare, I'll take this one. I've got 10 points less, I'll take this one. And 170 is... There are fragility issues with Evasion 2 expensive regiments. That's probably the biggest Achilles heel of Leonine Avatara. Damage output is not. 170 points is pretty reasonable. Finally, there are a bunch of syntax changes just in terms of how the Biomancies and Ferromancies are worded. No significant rules changes. There is a note here from the designers. Please note these actions are not spellcasting actions and do not need line of sight. Yep, knew that already. It's actually a really nice thing about Biomancies. The fact that offensive Biomancies don't need line of sight is part of the reason why, and it can be cast out of combat. They have no restrictions. They can be cast out of combat. They don't need line of sight. That's a big part of why I ran 2 Biomancies in a recent Spires list I took to an event. Overall, small changes to Spires, but particularly the Force-Grown Drone, so the Catabolic Node change, that's worthwhile. The small points drops, not unreasonable. I might now run, it's effectively, if you run Lineage Prideborn in a unit of Leonine, that's 20 points cheaper. Not unappealing, or almost not unappealing at that point. And then Mimetic Assassin is basically back to working the way that we think he should work. That's kind of nice. Overall small changes, but expected small changes. Where Spires really, what really has changed for Spires isn't Spires themselves, it's everything around them, because Spires released into what I've been calling really hostile territory. Spires released into a metagame where everyone had had the last 8 months to tune the hell out of their list and figure out the best stuff. And so if you played Spires, even casually, you were probably playing against lists people had been practicing for a while and working on and figured out. It was rough trying to play completely reworked Spires into that, even before the fact that there was some very powerful stuff in the game. And a lot of that powerful stuff has been tuned or reworked or adjusted, and everyone's now going to be figuring out their shit. which means Spires players have got kind of a breathing room to dig into the faction and figure out what works. In terms of lists I'll be looking at, probably Lineage, Prideborn, squeezing that into lists, because I do really like the idea of Leon and Avatara sitting behind Force-Grown drones. That works really nicely as a damage concentration, anvil in front, etc. And with points reductions to both the Prideborn and the Leonine, that's probably pretty appealing if you can keep the actual Leonine safe, particularly just from bulk hits because they collapse to that. All right, Euroni next, and changes in here are part of what I'm talking about when I say if you're a Spires player, it's not how your faction changed, it's how the game changed around your faction. It's kind of same for the 100 Kingdoms. 100 Kingdoms took a bunch of nerfs, technically speaking. A lot of the lists that I was running will have been reduced or given less points to work with as a result of the 100k changes, but they're not having to push it uphill into things like Euroni Spiders anymore. I don't think Euroni Spiders is gone, but I think Euroni Spiders literally as the definition of a meta archetype list where the rest of the list wasn't important probably has. Let's look at why. So, Mistress of the Ghostly Ryokai, blah blah blah. This is the loose formation thing that formed part of closed loop defense that Euroni Spiders had access to that made them so strong. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about here, right now, like when this video is being recorded before this patch goes live, a Jorogumu, Mahotsu, or Geisha will usually be affected by a Jorogumu Geisha's aura, which will be giving them, so they already have a very high wound count, tenacious, fearless, the ability to be healed, and they could get either evasion up to 3 or loose formation, which meant that there was basically no attack in the game other than if you had some way to inflict like 40 hits in one go, that was efficient against Jorogumu. Nothing else was. And that was what made them such a huge pain in the ass, because if you didn't build to deal with them, they were hugely difficult to bring down even an individual spider. And 40 hits all at one go with no special rules attached to them is great until you hit Dweghom where the whole army is defense 4, and they just weather that. So there was this horrible tension between a list that had to fight Dweghom and a list that had to fight Euroni Spiders, and never the two should meet. There have been a bunch of changes to Euroni Spiders, and the first of them is that they just can't get loose formation anymore, because now if you have a Mistress of Ghostly Ryokai, non-monster regiments can get loose formation when activating with Mu. That's still really nice to have, but it means that you can't have the Jorogumu Geisha activate and give it to everyone, blah blah blah. That's the first change. There are other changes as well. Kitsune Onmyoji, this is the spellcaster, gained AP, lost deadly shot, gained AP1 and rapid volley. Nice. She's a cool character, she should be taken more. She never quite competed effectively against the like melee blender characters like the Kitsune Bakusu. Maybe she does a little bit now, and there are some spellcasting changes, I think, to her coming as well, we'll have to see. Jorogumu Mahotsu, okay, this is the only thing I'm a bit worried about. 40 points reduction. That's a really, really big points reduction, but there are basically that's really big, and as a result, I kind of expect us to see Jorogumu Mahotsu appearing in like one Jorogumu Mahotsu, probably just at 240 points, probably just goes in most Euroni lists, but everything else about them has basically been nerfed. Evasion character, and this is the same for Jorogumu Aisha. Evasion characteristic 1 from 2. That's a really big deal because it means they can't get to evasion 3, which means armor piercing and cleave always works. Lost Fearless, that means terror works. When we get to the spells, we'll also see that their healing spell doesn't work on monsters, and they have to have a mainstay. Now, look, having a regiment in the warband is not a huge deal. That was really easy to do, but it was a like, why don't they follow this rule? Now they do. The evasion and the fearless and the removal of healing are all massive. Spiders are still very strong monsters, but now you can fight them with, like, if your list has good things in it, you can use the good things. Do you have AP1 shooting? That's perfectly fine. It's still a tenacious regiment with evasion 2 potentially, but that's okay. Do you have a monster with cleave and terror? That will do something now against a Jorogumu Geisha, where previously it would have done nothing. Really like these changes. The points reduction on the Mahotsu in particular, very aggressive. But I think she operates now more as a support unit and powerful monster and anchor and centerpiece to work alongside regular modular Euroni regiments rather than the archetype being 4 spiders YOLO, let's go. Jorogumu Geisha changes all of the same defensive changes. She has gained, so she stayed at 260 points, she has gained a rule. And this is pretty cool. Overall, I think she is weaker, and she needed to be, but this is pretty cool. You pick one of the two following. Phantom Onslaught, And this is a draw event, so bear that in mind. When an enemy charges you, they make a resolve roll. If they pass, they still have -1 to charge distance. If they fail, they lose shock and impact, -2 impact attacks. Okay, that's pretty neat. Or alternatively, and I think you'll be doing this one most of the time, when an enemy regiment declares a clash action against you, they perform a resolve characteristic. If they pass, they still have -1 to attacks. If they fail, they also lose inspired. That's not dread, but -1 attack is a really big deal just by itself. I think you'll basically always be using Veil of Doubt, and that's a very, very good rule. Overall, the Geisha in particular is probably the most nerfed because she was the combat combat Jorogumo. She was the one that generated the aura. I mean, they were both equally important to the Spiders archetype. I'm glad to see both of them suffer those durability reductions. I do think both of them are still playable, and I think Veil of Doubt's a very strong rule. But as an archetype, hoping that Spider Spam is now just a list like any other list. Change to modular regiments. This is really weird and difficult to read, but what it basically means is that now you can have, if you have 4 stands in a regiment, 2 of them have to be the leader stand, so the leader in another model. Then you can have 2 different stands. So you could have, for example, say 2 Kami and 1 Oni and 1 Tengubushi. That would be a legal modular regiment. It's not currently. You would have to have 3 Kami to make that legal. I don't know how often we're going to see 4-stand Euroni regiments, but there might be some interesting combos there. Other small changes, Kami Ayakashi down to 75 points. Yep, cool. Tengu Bushi, this is significant. Tengu Bushi, if they're the unit leader, you now have Vanguard 3 rather than 4. That's actually a really big deal because it means that they move 19 inches rather than 20, and 20 inches gets you onto a 9-inch diameter zone on the 24-inch line. 19 inches doesn't. However, Tengu Ayakashi gained a new rule. They also had the Vanguard reduction, but if there's a Tengu Ayakashi in a regiment, you get +1 March. That's probably very significant, but you could maybe work them into modular regiments. You could have something like a combat regiment with a Tengu Ayakashi and a Kitsune Onmyoji in it, perhaps. It's like a weird multi-role regiment. That could be a thing. The important thing is that if you want to blitz onto midfield objectives by using Fu and Vanguard and native high speed, you need Tengu Ayakashi to do it now, not just Tengu Bushi. Shikigami have been added to the game. They've got a new set of stats. They are just disruptive little shitters. That seems kind of cool. It's an interesting unit niche where they have this mix of like buffing rules with cheerful aura, and they're a pain in the ass to attack with loose formation and disruptive. They'll probably still disappear to a decisive like sharp blow, but they're cheap, cool. I think this is probably a solid stat block to them, but I have to see them in play. Daiokai has come down from 230 to 220 points, but his evasion has been reduced from 2 to 1. This is kind of similar. This is in line with the spider changes. So with Mu, you can't get them above evasion 2. That is a significant durability reduction. I generally found like Daiokai are much more fragile than spiders because they're not tenacious. Previously, they also weren't fearless. Now spiders aren't fearless either. So they'll still kind of be the weak link, but a Daiokai is still a very solid model. 220 points is very aggressive points cost for what the Daiokai can do. So I think the Daiokai remains fine. You just kind of always have to treat it as a little bit of a glass cannon, and that hasn't changed. Spells, now this does say syntax update, but let's just go through them really quickly. Iron Soul of Discipline, gains Untouchable, also gains Tenacious if below starting strength. That's Self, who has that? Just the Kitsune Onmyoji, but that's very different from what it gave before, which is Unyielding. That's genuinely a good buff. Blossom in the Wind, colossal fucking... okay. Loses Unstoppable, basically the regiment, if it can fail a charge, the regiment fails a charge. That's range 14. This is potentially really good. To note, it's not on the Mahotsu, it's only on the Onmyoji, the Kitsune Onmyoji, which I think probably begins to position the Kitsune Onmyoji as a genuinely cool supporting spellcaster. Hesitation, Bane of Deeds, also range 14, which is really long and really solid. Regiment can't get inspired, and if they don't have friends nearby when you cast the spell, also -1 clash. Scaling, so not exactly easy to cast, but this is a really significant nerf. Memory of Failure and Visage, -1 resolve. If the target regiment hasn't activated, an additional -1 resolve. And a change to now work on models that don't have a resolve stat, -1 defense instead. So this works on Old Dominion models, on animate vessels. Also a good spell, range 14. Repose in Healing Spring. This is the one that is a nerf. Achievement 4, range 12, Target-friendly modular regiment heals 3 wounds. Now, you can still heal back stands with that, but it's harder than if you could heal back 4. The main thing is friendly modular regiment. Can't heal Shikigami, can't heal monsters. Not being able to heal spiders for 4 wounds every round is a huge part of reducing the closed loop defense of the spiders list. This is still a fine spell. It succeeds very easily. It's a nice little chip heal, but I think we're going to be seeing more impactful spellcasting that isn't this spell from your only spellcasters. Honor Void of Self, no Entourage. Yeah, this is a very, very niche spell, but fine to have. Witness of the Void. Tiger Regiment adds +1 to its defense. This is the one that we'll now see cast proactively more often. You could always cast this, and it was a real pain in the ass on monster regiments. It's actually easier than before, I think, to cast on monster regiments. It used to be attunement 3 scaling, now it's attunement 4, and I'm pretty sure that all of the monsters that had Devout have retained their Devout. This is a really good spell. Dancing Shadows, regiment gains counterattack and parry. This is a nice set of rules to have in combination. This is a little bit of a tech spell, but handing out parry can be a huge deal, and counterattack is gravy on top. Flow, you can draw insight and check for obstruction through regiment this character is attached to as if it wasn't there. Yep, cool. That I very rarely use that, but you can, because generally Ayakashi will sort of hang out on the flanks, but okay, yep, you can shoot through friends. And then this character, so Purification Rites. This character can perform an entourage activation. 20 points down from 25. Important change about this is that this used to also require the character to have activated using the Mu card or the regiment had to be under the effects of Mu card, which meant the character had to be activating using Mu. Now it's just, you can just do an entourage activation. You have to have had a Mu character to include this in a list. I don't know if I would necessarily pay 20 points for an ability that everyone else gets for free and which is niche anyway. But there are going to be some cases where that's a big deal, particularly where you either go dual clash or you stack some ideal cards and activate quickly. So you do something like, say, Fu, Ka, Daimyo, March Charge, something like that. There are plays that you can make with this. Don't know if I would pay for it often, but it's no longer completely dead. Overall, look, there are some buffs in here. Spellcasting, your only spellcasting, is actually like legit as hell now. These spells are all a little niche and situational, but because you know so many of them, these are good. Like, these are really, really good. You should always have meaningful spellcasting that you can do with both an Onmyoji and a Mahotsu, and these more than make up for, spiders. Okay, cool. Yoroni now are a faction that wants to use magic and brutes and monsters and weave all of that together. I really like that. Shikigami, I think, are neat little shitters. No idea if they're good, but they're at least worth trying. And then Tengu Ayakashi as part of a modular regiment and the modular regiment change generally. Okay, interesting. We'll just see how that plays out. Overall, I like these changes. Up next, city-states. And wow, this is a lot of, now it says up here, we're aware of internal balance problems. We have prepared small adjustments to sweeten the wait for what's coming. This is sweetening the wait. There are a lot of points drops here. Like, the theme of the city-states adjustment seems to be everything gets a little treat if at all possible. Significant changes first. So, Hammer and Anvil, this is on the Hipparchos. It used to be a thing where you had to like get flank charges and you'd get Terrifying or something. Very difficult to make work. Now, once per round, infantry or cavalry can perform a free out-of-combat reform action. Sorry, combat reform, that's significant, but can't change the number of ranks or files during that action. Combat reform is very different to reform. You can't use it for charge threat extension. This is not going to come up hugely often, but it's nice enough to have. Much, much more significant is when an infantry or cavalry regiment is activated from the strat stack, it gains shock. As a reminder, activated from the strat stack includes by entourage. This is really good. This is just, you have a Thunder Chieftain in this faction now, and the Thunder Chieftain was the defining warlord in Wadrhun forever, and frankly still is post this update, although there's some competition now. This is not as powerful as all of your Speaker's Regiment gain shock, but it is very significant. You can kind of build an army around this pretty easily. Like, you can have Aniparkos in Companion Cav. You can have, like, Phalangites and Hoplites do not mind this at all. Anything off the strat stack with shock. Shock is a fantastic rule. This is legit. Now, shock on a regiment that has a fixed 8-inch charge is like, oh, okay, Rob, is that a hugely big deal? No, not necessarily, but like on Agama, there's plenty of occasions that you can take advantage of this, and it is much less conditional and much more useful. I'm not necessarily leaping out to run this guy instead of, for example, a Polemarch Warlord who's very good, but this is a good change. Army of Lions just had just had a note now. If both players have a Polemarch Warlord and each of them uses this ability, they cancel each other out. Okay, cool. Eidolon, 10 points cheaper. We're going to see that happen a lot. Eidolon is already pretty good. 100 points is very appealing. Mechanist, pre-6. Glory be. I think City States players have been asking for this for as long as City States have existed. Like, the number of times I have watched a City States player pick up 5 dice, fail a spell, and then just have this, like, resigned stare into the middle distance. Yeah, this is a huge difference in spellcasting success. They've been waiting a little while for this one, I think. Chrysador's Helmet, down to 30 points. This is just 30 points for Dread. Like, this is effectively the regiment gains Dread, because you only need to be in contact with one stand with Dread to lose Inspiration, and there's other stuff. Any other faction would pay 40 points for this. Yes, strictly speaking, if you manage to engage the regiment and you don't touch the Dread character, blah, 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 blah. But this is a really good relic now. This has significant effects. It's very strong. This is worth taking. Dread for 30 points is cheaper than, even with the little restrictions around you have to be able to get the character engaged, Dread for 30 points is cheaper than any other army would pay for that. Usually that's a 40-point rule. Living Breastplate, down to 5 points. This is the one that lets you reroll failed defense rolls during a duel. This is now the 5-point filler. If you have 5 points spare, you put this on a Polemarch or an Aristarch. Cool. Blades of Euclides, down to 30 points. This was already a really good relic. It's 10 points cheaper. Atlantis Spear, it's 5 points cheaper. Honestly, that's not unreasonable. Like, if you look at, there's an old, or there was, I'll see if it still exists, an Old Dominion relic called Blade of the Cellsaw that was better than Atlantis Spear and cheaper. If it still exists, it's still better than Atlantis Spear and still cheaper, but the delta is smaller. Hoplites, down 10 points. Also cheaper per stand. This is potentially a little concerning. Like, 35 points is the point at, like, 40 compared to 35. It feels like a small delta, and it probably is. But this is the point at which you can start having regiments become very easy to scale up. I don't know if we'll see this occur, but we might see Hoplites emerge as a possible regiment for, like, a Polemarch Warlord to go in, for example. They are 5 points less per stand than Phalangites. They have 1 less support, but they're 5 points less per stand, and their defensive output is higher. This is one just to keep an eye on. Probably fine, probably totally okay, but worth kind of just noting something that exists. Phalangites, 10 points cheaper. Agama, 10 points cheaper, cheaper per stand. Sadaroi, 10 points cheaper. Lose impact fluid formation irregular, gain loose formation flank, and +1 attack. We will see how these guys go. This is still a fragile regiment, but overall these are buffs. Sacred Band, 10 points cheaper. Clockwork Hoplites have gotten more expensive, 190 up from 180, no change to the cost per additional stand. One of the very few nerfs to a regiment in the army that we've seen. Minotaur Haspus, 7 wounds, that's good because they increased Therians, didn't increase Haspus. It's just nice to have that consistency. This is very good for Haspus. War Chariots also up 5 points, only 5 points. If you were running a reasonable quantity of these, and you will see actually if we scroll forward, now limited to maximum of 5.5 regiments per army in organized play. If you own 6 chariots, womp womp, you did the opposite of whatever buying the dip is. You have no one to blame but yourself for owning 6 of those things, or 8. If you owned 8 chariots, take the L and sell 3 of them. 4 chariots overall though, a 5-point nerf is more than accounted for. Like, any reasonable city-states army is going to be cheaper even if it was running maximum AVA of chariots, because the faction is swimming in points reductions as a result of this change. I'm fine with that. Chariots can be very frustrating to play into because they are a regiment that has that, like, monster resiliency effect where you can do 9 wounds to one and not reduce your damage output at all. And the damage output can be quite high. 135 points, not unreasonable. Syntax update on spells. As far as I can tell, all of these are the same and unchanged. It's just the presentation that has changed. So overall, city-states are fundamentally exactly the same army, except the Eparchos Warlord is something that we could see in play, particularly lists that are trying to do, like, weird or interesting or different things. You could run an Eparchos Warlord kind of in the same way that you would run a Aristarch Warlord, and he kind of fits with anything. But the main tale of the tape here is How many regiments in your army that you were taking previously are now 10 points cheaper? How many relics are 5 or 10 points cheaper? That's going to mean most city-states lists will be packing a whole extra stand in some regiment, and that tends to have significant knock-on effects. So, good day to be city-states. Also, the Mechanist is probably playable now, dare we say, rather than being kind of a meme bit where you would check to see how many times you can fail a spell each game. Yep, thumbs up for city-states players. This is not a transformative change, but lots of small buffs, and small buffs add up. All right, Wadrhun, carrying on through at a brisk pace. Chieftain, Concentrated Assault, Vanguard up to 4. That's pretty significant, as the developer notes. Lets you get onto certain objectives on round 2. That's kind of nice. Matriarch Queen, very small change. As far as I can tell, the only change about this is that you can now entourage into an entourage. You can go character, regiment, whereas you couldn't do that before. Before, you could only go character, regiment with her activated supremacy. Being able to do character, regiment lets you double battle cry with certain other conditions being met. That's a big deal. It doesn't necessarily make her a strong warlord. In fact, I would go as far as to say she's probably still not a strong warlord, but that's a nice little change. We also have a new supremacy for predators, mounted predators, and winglords. You pick a target enemy regiment at the end of the game's first supremacy phase, even one that isn't currently on the battlefield. Friendly regiments always count as under the effects of Inspired and Take Aim. Take Aim is probably the more significant of the two there when performing clash or volley actions against it. When it is destroyed, immediately select another prey. This is not particularly good if your opponent is on the money about things, because you will have to pick a regiment that your opponent wants to push forward and expose to danger. Because if you don't, if you pick a weak, like if you pick a unit of mercenary crossbows in 100 Kingdoms, guess what? Those mercenary crossbows are staying as far away from danger for as long as possible to deny you a supremacy. Now that has some utility. You're pushing unit out of the action. You have to pick a regiment that your opponent can't afford to pull out of the action. They are going to be, I can just see a lot of counterplay with this by your opponent, but it is probably better than the current supremacy, and it's kind of interesting. And you can probably build a list meant to take reasonably consistent advantage of this. And it is always under the effects of Inspired. That's significant when dealing with things like Dread, for example, because it will counter that. I don't overall expect this to be played very often, because the Thunder Chieftain still exists, and he is just going to be better in any list that you would probably build with Predators, Mounted Predators, and Winglords. But hey, cool, that's nice. Small syntax change to the Conquest, the chosen of Conquest supremacy. This is not the significant change. There's a much more significant change to him coming. We'll get to soon. Visions of War. You still have the gain tenacious when you chant the battle cry from the Cult of War. Now you also have, so now the Scion of War also has an activated portion of the supremacy. Friendly regiments gain hardened 1 until the end of the round. I cannot emphasize enough how much of a big deal this is. Anyone who has played against 100 Kingdoms Order armies is like, oh, it's just hardened 1. How much of a big deal could that be? No, army-wide hardened is really significant. You will have to build to take advantage of this. Don't build a list comprised entirely of Raptor Riders, for example, but hardened 1 on regiments that are already getting tenacious and might have native defense 3 or defense 4. This is really significant. This is actually kind of pushed. Now, is this better than the supremacy on the Thunder Chieftain? No, probably not. But there have been some other small changes to the meta Thunder Chieftain army that just pull it back very, very slightly. And this is strong enough that if you build for it just a little, it opens up an archetype. I think this is a good change. I think this is a very solid change. This is appealing as a warlord ability. These two abilities in combination are good. They're strong defensively, and I've played as and against too much orders in 100 Kingdoms to underrate hardened 1 for a turn. I like this a lot. Mounted Predator gains Flurry, cool. Range is reduced, the regiment is attached to gains Deadly Shot, volley characteristic decreased, evasion characteristic increased. This is just to make the Mounted Predator fit in alongside Raptor Riders, as they note. Yep, cool. Deadly Shot on Raptor Riders is interesting. They're not a ranged regiment, but they're not primarily a ranged regiment. They can do ranged chip. This pushes that ranged chip up a little, particularly with the Mounted Predator involved. Yep, that's cool. Predators, down 10 points, down some range. The range, I don't think is a huge deal, because I was going to say I want them inside slingers, but actually this is a range reduction if you put them in slingers. Slingers are still range 18, unless that got changed ahead, and I don't think it did. This is a nerf. 10 points for 2 inches of range reduction on one stand is probably fine, but it's going to produce situations where any regiment that you put him in finds this a little bit awkward. Not the end of the world, and 10 points is 10 points, but this is just going to produce a little bit of awkwardness. Scion of Conquest. When you are the Warlord, one Drum Beast can be a mainstay. This is called a sales-motivated buff, because the sales team put together a pack that included a Drum Beast and had to include a mainstay regiment that wasn't currently a mainstay. That's why this exists. Is it bad? No, it's fine. Mainstay as a Drum Beast is kind of neat, but you weren't hugely hurting in Scion of Conquest Warlord warbands for mainstays, because Chosen of Conquest are quite good. However, there are some chunky points reductions coming in particular to the Drum Beast, so sure, go ahead, fill your boots, this is totally fine. Scion of Death, 20 points, gains Priest 1, doesn't gain any spellcasting, but generates interference. That is really, really useful. Now, we have just come through a metagame where if you could take interference, you put interference in your list, because Dweghom were incredibly powerful and Sorcerer Kings were incredibly powerful, and you wanted to stop spiders from healing each other. Interference is a hugely valuable rule, to the point where you would use up artifact slots, you would pay for it if you could. Primodynamic Globe is very close to an auto-include if you have those 10 points. It's like the first artifact I would add to many city-states lists. Cool, you've got it on a character now. She's Priest 1, she doesn't cast any spells, but she generates interference. And she's 20 points cheaper. This is a very nice change. She's also better at dueling. This just Priest 1, if nothing else, this gives her a unique use case, because there's another way to get interference in a list now in Wadrhun. That's a big deal. Scion of War got the same thing. This is a big deal. He also got a Ball of Supremacy, as noted. 10 points cheaper, gains Priest 1. Also even better in a duel, higher defense stats. Wadrhun now can build a list that does not rely on the Chosen of Conquest for interference. That's really valuable. From buffs to nerfs, Winglord Predator used to get Terror +1 from chanting the battle cry. Now it gets the free volley. That is to say, it lost the free volley innately. This is a really big nerf, but I think it is worthwhile. We have seen Quattles and Winglords. I'm pretty sure this change is happening to Quattles as well. We've seen Quattles and Winglords become a very integral part of particularly Wadrhun Speaker's Menagerie lists, where you had like Thunder Riders and they gave everything shock. And you would usually see in the meta versions of those lists, you would often see 2 Winglords and 2 or 3 Quattles. And you may well still see that, but one of the big things that that list did was it's like, oh, this is a melee army, right? There are all of these big angry birds and these Thunder Riders, and everything has shock. But what you could actually do is put out just a prodigious amount of ranged firepower, because Quattles and Winglords aren't, they're good gunfighters. It's a small number of dice, but it's a reasonably high quality attack. And with 3 shots, you could do so much. You can still make those range attacks, but you can't move, shoot, move back. You can't move, aim, shoot. You can't move onto the battlefield, move, shoot. It's just, this is significant. It's very warranted, because those were very powerful in like a subtle way that wasn't always obvious at first glance. And this is a change to them. It doesn't reduce their wounds characteristic, doesn't reduce their offensive output, like if they make those attacks. It does give them, it means that they don't get terror when they chant the battle cry anymore, which is significant. It's a nerf. It's a significant nerf. I think it's warranted. Beads of Death. Effectively completely reworked, because this was the artifact that gave Tenacious. Now it doesn't. That does kind of suck a little bit, because Tenacious is a really, really powerful rule. Now it gives Blood Sacrifice. The regiment you're attached to suffers 2 wounds. Don't trigger morale tests. The regiment gains +1 march till the end of its first action. This is a way of increasing threat range on regiments that might really benefit from that. It's only going to be +1 march for the first action, but that includes for charges, it includes for marches. A lot of the times that's optional +1 charge distance. You could put this on Thunder Riders, and basically for the rest of the game, your opponent has to treat their charge threat as 1 inch longer. Because they have a fixed charge, you will always know if this is needed to succeed, and so they just have 1 more inch of threat that you get to play with. This is fine. I wouldn't auto-include this in lists, but particularly on Thunder Riders, I would give this strong consideration. Death's Reach down 10 points, good item on the characters that can take it. I think this one is restricted effectively to Predators, but I think we'll absolutely see this on Mounted Predators and Raptor Riders. Blood is now, this is really interesting. This is now a heal that is conditional on destroying enemy stands, maximum of 5 wounds. You can absolutely have a regiment of like a Chosen of Death with a Scion of Death can definitely destroy 3, 4, or even 5 stands in a clash. Now, assuming its points haven't changed, this is still a 20-point artifact, so I don't know if I would reach out to take it, but this is probably better than it was previously. Cure now lets you ignore hits or wounds from Lethal Demise, Aura of Death, and Decay. This is a meta pick, but there will be times that you will really like having access to this. Chosen of Conquest, this is just, this rule becomes a floating text, that's fine. Chosen of Death, okay. Points 210 up from 180. That's really significant. It's a very expensive increase. Evasion characteristic increased to 3 from 1. Evasion 3 is a really strong defensive ability. Now, 210 points is a lot, but Evasion 3 potentially puts a lot of durability in this regiment, particularly given that they have ways of healing now with the blood mechanic. I don't personally know Wadrhun well enough to tell you whether or not this is good, but I think this is a buff to the regiment overall. In my experience, there is a big difference between Evasion 2 and Evasion 3, and the fact that these girls now are Evasion 3 natively rather than needing a Scion of Death to get even to Evasion 2 means you can probably take them independently. 210 is a lot. Not sure how a list that uses these will play, but they are blenders and they are probably now durable enough to be mostly worth the points cost. If you've seen these things attack, you will be well aware of how horrifically dangerous they can be. Now, they probably have the durability to at least survive if something jumps in on them. And while I would say that they are not a durable regiment, with a Scion of Death, their resolve is good. Without it's a little bit average, but Evasion 3 and 5 wounds upstand is at least a level of durability that means you're probably going to get some attacks in. This is probably an overall improvement, and that's not something I would say often about a 30-point points increase, but it is probably an overall improvement to Chosen of Death. Here we go. Slingers down to range 16. Okay, so significant points reduction. Points 150 down from 165. This makes some sense of the Predator's range change. When you have a Predator in this regiment, its overall points cost has decreased by 25 points. 16 to 18 is a significant range difference, though. Once you get basically below 20 inches, all of your range reductions begin to start producing a situation where it's slightly easier for your opponent to at least march charge into you, sometimes even charge into you. Not much can charge 16 inches, but it's not impossible. But plenty of things have credible, like, march charge threat ranges of 16 inches, but not 18 inches. It's a big points reduction. There are lots of things seeing general range cuts this patch. I think slingers are still good, and again, points are points. Points are what you use to pay for the models in your army. 25 points cheaper between slingers and a predator isn't insignificant. It's probably worth that. Like that points reduction probably pays for the inconvenience of the range reduction, but it is worth noting. Veterans 10 points cheaper, Chosen of War 20 points cheaper. That is a lot, but they were probably overcosted before. 200 points is still relatively expensive, but I would say now it's kind of attractive. These guys are very tough, they do plenty of damage, but they're kind of just a generic heavy otherwise. They're just this nice big pile of stats, but susceptible to cleave, susceptible to evasion. At 200, there's a little bit of a risk that they start being spammable is not exactly the right way of putting it, but material-oriented Wadrhun, where you just try and take very efficient rules. There's some possibility that like larger quantities of Chosen of War could become an issue, but they are a heavy regiment, and to date we haven't really seen heavy spam armies work as an archetype, so this is probably safe. Heavy regiments should be powerful, they should be efficient relative to their points cost. Chosen of War are now very efficient relative to their points cost, particularly with Fearless. Warbred gain Fury. This is a small buff, but it is nice, particularly on a Juggernaut regiment. Drum Beast, 20 points cheaper. 270 points for that pile of wounds is not bad at all. Tauntaur, 10 points cheaper, small buff. Quattle, same rules change. I might have misread the Winglord Predator change. Looking at this, it now seems like, for practical purposes, Predatory Shriek is terrifying +1 and you may perform a free volley. Obviously, you're very unlikely to use both of those in the same activation. You could theoretically. No, what I'm talking about, of course you could. You could free volley charge clash. You could free volley, like march free volley charge. Okay, so less of a nerf to Quattles and Winglords than I had thought. I misread the one above. So the Winglord presumably still keeps Predatory Shriek. Now Quattles get Predatory Shriek, but they have to chant the battle cry to get a free volley. You know what? Okay, that's fine. I I have been traumatized by these things. I think they are very strong. That is less of a nerf than I thought, but it does still reduce it's still a gentle touch to the range damage output of a speaker-centric army. So still very much in favor. That was still something that needed to be tweaked. This is less of a change than I thought. The damage output of Quattles and Winglords is completely unchanged. Yep, fair enough. Aberration, 10 points cheaper, and then some syntax updates to spells. Notable, the Decay special rule post-Spires update has changed. Is this a good spell now? Situationally, it's very dangerous. But in those cases, it remains basically impossible to cast because it's attunement 3 scaling, and it's only good on really large regiments. So overall thoughts on the Wadrhun update. Very gentle change to the current dominant archetype, which is Speakers, Quattles, Winglords, Thunder Riders with a Thunder Rided Chieftain. Very small nerf to that army, little bit of a reduction in its range damage output. In exchange, the Scion of War in particular probably people have been trying to make like Scion of War lists work, and they've been kind of fine. I would say there's a good chance, not a certainty, I'd say there's a good chance they emerge as a contender archetype alongside the speakers list. More generally, the fact that the speakers list had only a very, very gentle change to its range damage output is getting off lightly, because that speakers list, that's like 2 Thunder Riders, 4 or 5 Birds, Raptor Riders, and or Hunting Pack, that list was a strong contender for one of the meta lists. It wasn't as good as, say, like the top 3, 4 best list in the game, but it was right there behind them. It was good enough to compete, and it's effectively been almost unchanged, a small nerf to its range damage output, while like Spider Zeroni no longer exists as an archetype, and when we get to Dweghom, we're going to see big changes to like Magma, stuff like that. So Speakers Wadrhun got off pretty lightly. Slinger nerf is fine, it's accompanied by a very significant points drop, points drops in lots of other cases. And the Scion of War and Death, both significant changes, because they give you interference, that's a big deal. And Scion of War, I think, is now possibly the basis for a credible archetype. People have been trying to make him work, not succeeding. Hardened 1 army-wide is pretty baller. So we'll be interested to see if that emerges, or if it doesn't quite displace the Dino Riders. Alright, speaking of Dweghom, let's get into Dweghom. A bunch of changes on this first page that are all just adjustments for clarity and don't make any significant difference. Moving on. Steel Shaper Supremacy. Always active, heals 2 wounds when a non-monster becomes awakened. Once per game, you can spend 3 markers to make this 5 wounds instead. During this round, when friendly Forge Regiment activates, add an elemental pool marker. This is just, as far as I can tell, you can no longer at all heal monsters. Previously, you couldn't do the 5 points of healing on a monster, but you could do the 2 points of healing. It was only ever Forge Regiments in any case, which means Hellbringer Drakes and Stoneforged. I had not personally observed the Steel Shaper Supremacy to be overperforming, but Tempered were very strong generally, and the 2 Tempered Warlords have both received hits. Probably, frankly, still leaving them as the most powerful archetype in Dweghom, but by a smaller margin. The Forge Master Supremacy, that is the Tempered Sorcerer Supremacy, does all of the same things, but now halves the range of spells that you arc through Awakened Command Stands. So where previously you might have cast a 16-inch coruscation, now if you cast that spell through a command stand, it'll be 8 inches instead. That's pretty significant, but it still lets you relieve engaged range regiments. Like Fireforge, for example, they're engaged in melee. You can still free them up or help them by fireballing into combat, either from them or a nearby regiment, while your spellcasters are somewhere else on the battlefield. So this is still a really good supremacy, but it changes particularly Tempered Sorcerer Warlord lists from having the longest non-infinite threat ranges in the game. They did have those post-January update with the Inferno Automata change to this. This is a good change. This is honestly not a massive nerf. It still lets a lot of the exciting things you can do with this happen, but it stops you from projecting such a long threat range across such a large amount of the board. More small adjustments to clarity. Runeforge Plate up to 25 points, but not actually a nerf, because now you can use those markers to either gain 2 or 4 attacks rather than 1 or 3. So effectively, 5 points plus 1 attack on something like a Steel Shaper, that's really good. Plus 4 attacks on a Steel Shaper who has Terror and Smite, massive deal. World Breakers, is the Dweghom mastery that I mentioned talking about 100 Kingdoms, where you can't have your defense reduced below 3, up to 60 points now. So 100 Kingdoms players who are bemoaning the change to Armor of Dominion, Dweghom have it worse. Look, I was already of the opinion this was too expensive. Now it is definitely too expensive, but it is such a powerful relic that it should be niche. This should be the relic that you bust out when you are specifically worried about a certain thing and are building to counter a specific metagame and shouldn't be regularly taken otherwise. So this is fine. The number of times I would take it in a list has changed from 0 to 0, but it should always have been niche. It was niche, it stays niche at 60 points. Fireforge, attack characteristics decreased to 3. Thank you very much. This was my least favorite change of the Dweghom update, because Fireforged have always beaten the shit out of me personally in melee, because they were just men-at-arms in melee with defense 4, resolve 3. Why were they good in melee and so good in ranged and so durable? It was also really annoying because it was a lesson that had been learned and then seemed to have gotten unwound. Like, Dweghom spent a long time rework dialing in certain regiments. One of those was Fireforge, points changes and this and that. One of the last changes to Fireforge pre-update was the attacks changing to 3. Like, okay, if you can actually just get in on these guys, they won't now beat the shit out of you in melee. I don't know why it ever changed back to 4. That didn't make any particular sense to me, but I am very glad that it's back to 3. There is now more of a counter to Fireforge. Like, yes, Tempered Sorcerer, the damn things are going to arc a fireball at you, but if you tie them up in melee, they at least aren't likely to fight their way out as easily. Big fan of this. Flame Berserkers, points reduction, 155. More significant Aura of Death value to 2. This is an increase most of the time. Flame Berserkers currently Aura of Death 4, but that's just 4 hits. Now they are 2 per stand, which means that a full regiment inflicts 6 hits on you. You can also scale the regiment up. 60 points per stand is expensive. I don't think you'll do that very often, but overall a significant buff. The average Aura of Death they will do has probably increased, and cost has decreased. Hold Warriors, when awakened, gains impact 2. This is the only significant change to clans that I can kind of find, but that's actually pretty neat. Now, I don't think this is going to interact at all with the Crown of Ushklosh, because Crown would apply first and then you would awaken. A Crown gives you +2 impact attacks, then you awaken, gain impact 2, they don't stack. But this is strictly a buff, kind of nice to have, gives you a little bit of back pocket text for tech for going after objectives, etc. So this is cool. Initiates. Points cost decreased by 10. Cost per stand decreased by 5. When awakened, gain support +1. Initiates people have been complaining about for some time post rework. This is a significant buff. Effectively, this is support +1, 10-point reduction, and stand reduction. They are still not going to be absolute ballers in melee, right? Their clash isn't high enough. But they aren't meant to be. They're meant to be able to fight and grind and hold a character and be durable. They've got high native defense. They've got good resolve. Just by themselves with Phalanx, if they're being attacked in the front, defense 4, resolve 4, that's very good on a 140-point regiment. But they couldn't really capitalize on that. Now, if you want to put a character in them and scale them up a little bit, you get a bit out of that. Probably not still fantastic, but they're also, particularly in an Ardent list, they're the only regiment that does that kind of thing. Ardent is a sack full of hammers. Having an anvil that's like, oh, yeah, it's a buff, that's kind of appealing, probably worthwhile. Speaking of Ardent buffs, Magma Forged. Now, this is sort of like kind of not a lot of changes, but also kind of a lot of changes, because their Aura of Death is 3. Right now, Magma Forged are Aura of Death 4 for the entire regiment. Now it's 3 per stand, which means that now a stand of, like, a regiment of 4 of them, or 5 of them, that's engaging you wide, and I have seen Magma Forged that are that wide, often with a character. Let's say you have 4 stands engaged, you have just tripled the amount of Aura of Death that you deal, from 4 hits up to 12 if you have 4 stands of Magma Forged engaged. That's really significant, and Herald of Magma down 5 points, only 5 points, but the Herald of Magma makes Magma Forged into an Ardent regiment. This really, Ardent was one of the, Ardent and Clans both needed buffs. Clans have not seen significant changes, but Ardent, at least, this is a little change. This is good for Tempered, but it is also good for Ardent, and things that are good for Ardent will help increase the variability inside Dweghom. Wardens, 10 points cheaper. Inferno Automata, 10 points more, but Aura of Death value adjusted. This is, again, an increase. Inferno Automata tend to have very long threat ranges. They can get into melee very easily. inflicting 6 Aura of Death hits from a regiment that is engaging you. A 3 that is engaging you is nice. Points increase. I think changes to Magma spellcasting in particular are actually going to knock Inferno Automata back a fair bit in the absence of any other changes. So this could be a significant double hit that pushes them back out. We will kind of have to wait and see on that. The changes to the Tempered Sorcerer Warlord and Magma spellcasting were already a huge blow to these guys, but it was an army archetype that needed to see some change. This is an extra hit to Inferno Automata, but the Aura of Death change is a consolation prize, so they may be fine. I think we will shift to... I wouldn't be surprised if this 10-point adjustment gets wound back in future, because a lot of the reasons you took Inferno Automata weren't related to the Automata themselves, but they're a fine regiment. Found down 20 points from 180 to 160. This was one of the most reviled regiments in the army. I have a local player who has been on a crusade against these things for ages. He hates them. The things he hates about them is that they don't do very much damage at range, and that probably hasn't changed. 20 points is a big reduction, though. Maybe you can splash these into an army now. They are a size 2 ranged regiment. They're definitely more appealing at 20 points cheaper. That isn't the same as good. However, they are at least now the same cost as Fireforge, rather than 20 points more expensive, and they do have longer ranged. Finally, in terms of regiment changes, Steelforged attacks down from 4 to 5. Now, this should be read as attacks down from 7 to 6. That is still a lot of attacks out of a regiment. This is a very, very needed change. Steelforged were probably the most efficient regiment in the game. Frankly, they are still one of the most efficient regiments in the game. They are very close to an Ashen Dawn regiment that is medium and cheaper, but the astounding damage output that they used to do is now just a little bit less. And regiments are allowed to be good, right? Like, I have had games where I've hit a unit of Steelforged, I've done 9 wounds to them, that's killed 1 stand, and then the 2 stands that remain have 1-tapped the regiment that went into them and then gone on a killing spree. And while that is terrifying to experience, it is okay for powerful restricted regiments to exist. Regiments are allowed to be good. I don't have that experience and go, this regiment should cost 400 points and have 1 attack so I can never see them again. That's the wrong reaction, right? You don't want to over-nerf things. This is a very gentle adjustment to a regiment that needed adjustment, but it keeps their defense intact, it keeps their resolve intact, it keeps the direction that they have with Tempered Creed intact. And I am okay with that. As much as they have traumatized me, I am okay with that, because you don't want a habit of game designers to nerf regiments that have that kind of power into unplayability. Small adjustments, this is a small adjustment, very warranted. I wouldn't have been surprised to have also seen, say, a points change, for example, up to 210. We didn't see that. I think that's fine. This puts them closer to reasonable, with the note that not every regiment has to fit within a perfectly equal performance bracket. Things like Steelforged, which are standouts in the army and one of the signature regiments, can be good, and they are still good. Now we get to these spellcasting changes, and these are the big ones. This is not just syntax changes. Magma, particularly big changes. And so we will basically, like, Coruscation doesn't generate a token anymore, still an Attunement 4 spell. Cool, sweet. Here is the big change. Magmatic Seep, target piece of zonal terrain, cancels erupting, and loses cover for the rest of the game. This is really cool, right? The fact that Dweghom can burn down forests, that's sick as hell. I really like that. The more important thing is that this is no longer creating a token that creates a terrain piece. You no longer get to place erupting terrain anywhere, which means that the near infinite range, oppressive nature of Dweghom Magma spellcasting is now entirely bounded by terrain that exists on the battlefield, and that's a really big deal, because there was a very strong, borderline oppressive Dweghom list that was built around the fact that any regiment could work as an arc node that you could target spells out of, and any regiment could therefore be used to cast the previous version of Magmatic Seep to create a token, which was terrain, which then a theoretically infinite number of Pyroclast could be cast from, which meant that any regiment anywhere on the board, but especially Inferno Automata, had a massive threat range, and basically it allowed Dweghom near impunity. You could not avoid damage from Dweghom offensive spellcasting on turn 2 if you brought a regiment onto the board, even if you sat on the back table edge. That is gone. Now, all of the rules for arcing those spells, targeting things, etc., those all still exist. Range reduction on using command stands as a spellcasting point of origin, but it's now gated by terrain. Your opponent can now counterplay against the threat range of this offensive spellcasting by avoiding terrain that you could cause to catch fire. I will note 6 inches is a range increase, and this is actually a fairly large increase in total threatened volume of the table. Previously, this was 5 inches. 6 inches around a forest is a much like that's a increase in radius in a not quite circular but near enough shape. That's a multiplicative increase in the total area that is covered. So there is a consolation prize here, but you can now be like, yeah, on turn 2, I'm not going to move within 6 inches of a forest or a building or a piece of water. I'm just going to initially position to avoid that so that I can at least get my army developed before I start taking damage. This is a very good change. This is a change to a trend that had emerged in both Dweghom and Sorcerer Kings, having not quite but very close to unconditional infinite range offensive tools. Those are very bad to have in a rank and flank because there is no counterplay to them, or very limited counterplay. There was some against Dweghom, there was none against Sorcerer Kings. That has been removed. Holistically, I still think you could take a list that was a magma list that was run at a recent event and run it immediately after this patch drops, and it would probably still be very playable because, spoiler alert, we play with like 7 to 9 terrain pieces as standard on most tables. That's still a lot of the table that is potentially threatened, but it's not threatened immediately on arriving on the board on turn 2, which allows some breathing room and some counterplay. Now, as far as I can tell, basically all of these other changes, like these are all just syntax changes otherwise, apart from, I think, Roots of Stone is different. Roots of Stone now, enemy regiments, -2 march, friendly regiments, counterattack and parry. Previously, it was any regiment targeted gained -2 march and +1 defense. Now it does different things based on what it's targeting. That turns this actually into potentially a really good spell. Attunement 4 scaling is very easy to cast in Tempered. You get very high spellcasting numbers. Giving something -2 march can be backbreaking. Giving a friendly regiment, particularly something like Steelforged, counterattack and parry, can be very good. This is now kind of always useful. It isn't this weird thing that you have to pick when you're going to use and have to be weird and techy about. It's just good. Broken Ground now also causes the enemy to lose Juggernaut and has the potential to inflict wounds if you fail a charge. In practice, I don't know how much that's going to come up. This is still kind of a niche rule, but there are some things in the game that really don't like have Juggernaut being taken away. So, okay, neat. Niche spell, less niche than it was. And then finally, I don't think this is a change that they're actually going to make. Temporal Plate now targets enemy regiments, giving the enemy regiments Indomitable and Tenacious. Definitely a nerf to that spell, not something you'll want to cast often, and I suspect this is just a little bit of an error. I might actually just drop a quick line to the devs. I wouldn't be surprised if this gets corrected in the release version of this document. This is obviously a copy and paste error. Be very funny to leave in there, but I think we'll see this change back to target friendly regiment, and so therefore unchanged. So the big changes to Dweghom, like Aura of Death, the Ardent Creed is probably the most significant beneficiary of the Aura of Death changes, and of little points, costs, and adjustments here and there. It's a good day to be an Ardent player, which is not something that you would say very often, because historically they have played second fiddle to Tempered Creed, while clans have been distant third child, underwater, drowning, or dead. That hasn't changed for clans, even with the Hold Warrior adjustment. And if I had to guess, I would say Tempered Creed are probably still the strongest creed to pick in Dweghom. But the gap has narrowed, and that's generally good. And the very top end of Dweghom, who were faction-definingly strong, they were like meta-definingly strong, is now the extreme threat ranges and options that they had are just trimmed back a little bit. In particular, the magma change is very significant. And so overall, I would expect Dweghom and especially Tempered Creed to still absolutely stay a very strong army, particularly an army that is able to do things like build a defense skew and really jump on players who aren't prepared for that defense skew. But overall, the most oppressive elements of the army are now gone, and if you're interested in Ardent, now's a great time to play them. Alright, Sorcerer Kings next. A quite large number of buffs and some very significant nerfs to infinite ranged offensive ritual casting. Elemental Dominion. This is the Raja's Supremacy, changed I think to Court of Water, gaining terrifying and impact attacks if charging in the flank or rear. That's pretty neat. Water is a very good court to be picking generally. Merid are a regiment that is fantastic at doing things like March Charge Spellcast, and now they'll be a little bit better at that. Mahabharati Sardar, cheaper, good, because he was never taken. Probably still won't, but who knows. Sorcerer, range increased up to 16. That will now match Dan her disciples, which have been reduced to 16. Quality of life change. Favorite of Hormus, 15 points. That's unchanged. I think the only significant change here is within range of an earth piece of zonal terrain. That is to key in with the broad change that they've made, not having terrain markers, instead actually keying to terrain that is on the battlefield. Now a Mahut ridden by a Maharaja counts as, it still counts as Earth, but now it's not Earth marker, now it's Earth piece of zonal terrain. Dan her disciples, 10 points cheaper, 2 inches less range. As a Spires player, I am happy about this because Danho Disciples were previously a strictly better version of Marksman clones for cheaper with higher defensive stats. They didn't have access to the strain, but anyway. Um, 16 inches is notable. There is, like, every time you reduce range, you increase the number of things that can potentially threaten you from inside of that range. This is significant. So is a 10 points cost reduction. But if you are a Sorcerer Kings player, this is a drop to her performance. We're also going to see changes to spellcasting that reduce the damage output here as well. Homing Winds in particular is no longer the best range buff in the entire game, period. So 10 points is 10 points, and that is nice, but this is notable and a reduction, although a Sorcerer in a unit her Disciples is still a nice regiment to take. From a nerf to a buff, Mahabharati Initiates pushed. 10 point reduction gains Tenacious, that's incredible. And then now you gain a special rule based on your Warlord's Court. And yes, I am pretty sure that if you're running a Maharaja Warlord, you get both of these, which means that once again the Maharaja Warlord will remain the only Warlord ever taken in Sorcerer Kings, because these are really good. Juggernaut, Opportunist, counts as having cover if within 3 inches of water zonal terrain, regeneration. The best two, I would say, are Fire Earth for Juggernaut and Regeneration 2. This is still a regiment that is only Evasion 2, but Evasion 2 Tenacious 1 is very good. 150 points, you could spam the absolute hell out of these. You could run a Fire Earth Maharaja. These are a mainstay. Just max out on these. This may have overbuffed this regiment because Speed 6 Juggernaut, Evasion 2 Tenacious Regen for 150, that's pushed as hell. Possibly overbuffed. To really take advantage of that, you will have to own many boxes of these. I don't recommend going out and buying 10 boxes of these because of this change, or even 2 or 3 boxes, but maybe 1 or 2, because especially Fire Earth, very strong. Rajaka, cost per stand, down to 35. Probably don't still run big regiments of these, but this is kind of appealing. Windborn Jin, down 10 points. Nice. This was an okay regiment. The main change here is that their immediate competition, Dan Her Disciples, which did tend to significantly outperform them, have had a range reduction, admittedly also a points reduction. Windborn Jin are now the only 18-inch range regiment in the faction, which meaningfully differentiates them. Merid Sahar, just a change to account for water zonal terrain. Mahut, just a change to account for water zonal, so for earth zonal terrain. Now, rather than creating a token, it makes zonal terrain count as earth until the end of the game. So, much like Dweghom Magma, Sorcerer Kings now do lots of terraforming of terrain that already exists on the table, rather than creating markers or tokens. Rakshasa, 10 points cheaper. Ravana, 10 points cheaper. These were both solid if fragile monsters. Nice changes to have. Fire needed a little. Fire was, frankly, look, fire was good. It's just that air and water in particular had come to eclipse it a little bit. So, yeah, small buffs here, absolutely warranted. Reasonable enough. These are still good monsters. Trinaverta. Lost a wound, lost loose formation, but gained Tenacious against volleys instead. This is overall a small reduction in its durability against volleys. Not massive, like less than you would think, because Tenacious against volleys is still very good, but loose formation was stronger. These are very gentle nerfs to a regiment that was performing quite well. Although my personal observation is, although I think Europe saw quite a lot of like multiple Chandavat armies. I think America might have as well. My experience was always that the first one was very solid, but the Chandavats and Shagbaris both really wanted to activate after a ritual, and there was just a lot of like competition for that activate after an air ritual slot. I remember seeing a list that had, I think 3 Trinoverta Chandavats, and it's like, you can't possibly have all of them, or even multiple of them per round, really maximally benefiting from the ritual synergy. And without that, they are, I mean, they're good, but they're merely good. Now, I think, yep, having 1 or even 2 of these in a list is still very solid, but this is a small but meaningful nerf. Trinoverta Shabgari, 10 points reduction. That's pretty significant, but it gained impact as well. Evasion reduced from 2 to 3. This was previously an Evasion 3 native. Now to get to Evasion 3, it has to activate Perform a March using the Air Elemental rule. So this is overall a reduction in its resiliency, but accompanied by a points change. So overall for the regiments, some buffs, some nerfs, mostly modest. We get to the spells and we have all of the usual syntax changes, but some other significant changes as well, in particular with respect to the rituals. I'm probably going to miss some of these, but just kind of jumping ahead. Lifting Winds now gains all friendly court target friendly court of so it says target friendly court of air regiments within 12, which makes me think this is kind of an aura. The regiments, yeah, plural gains, so this gives unstoppable to everything within 12. Homing Winds, big change. Regiment rerolls failed to hit rolls of 6 when performing a volley. This is a massive change relative to previous, where it would reroll all. This was the best range buff in the entire game previously, where it used to give full range rerolls. Now it's range rerolls of 6. That is a fine spell. If you're running water and air, you can give a Maharaja Warlord Stanho Disciples aim, shot, and reroll 6s, which is a nice suite of buffs, particularly if you don't have any offensive spells to cast. But previously you could give them aim, shot, full rerolls, or just full rerolls if they were air. This spell was historically the source of some of the most imbalanced Sorcerer King stuff. Even post-adjustment to only work on air court, still very strong. I welcome this change. Other significant changes have occurred. So Spiteful Winds, and when we get to some water rituals, we'll also see infinite range, unrestricted, unconditional, offensive, spellcasting, or rituals now gone. Previously, Spiteful Winds targeted any regiment anywhere on the battlefield. Now it does more hits, but it just targets a regiment engaged with a friendly elemental court of air regiment. 5+X, where X is your defense characteristic, that's not bad for an army mechanic. It's not fantastic, but it's not bad. The important thing is that it doesn't target anything anywhere on the game board. Very, very welcome change. Blood to Water now gets a little boost. Previously, Blood to Water did nothing against models with like Animate Vessel with no resolve stat. Now, if no resolve, 2 additional hits instead. This is one of the best offensive spells in the game when cast by things like Marid Sahar. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some small adjustments to this in future updates. For now, gotten off scot-free, and fair enough. This is a nice buff for water, and water, I think, as a result, probably going to be one of the dominant courts moving forward. Kind of already was. It had a weakness where the resolve characteristic regiments without resolve characteristics it really fell off against. 2 additional hits is not as many. Like, you often have like 5 additional hits from this spell, 4 additional hits. 2 additional hits against animate vessels is still nice to have. But the more significant change is Call Forth the Deep now targets zonal terrain on the battlefield to count as a water terrain keyword, which is very significant because Violent Geyser, which still does 6 hits AP1 to enemy regiments within water zonal terrain, now you can't Call Forth the Deep anywhere on the table and create a marker and hit any regiment anywhere on the board. Now they have to be touching terrain. Plenty of times in the game, your opponent will be touching zonal terrain, but it's no longer unconditional damage at infinite range. I remember at CanCon, I heard a story about someone who took a Theist Priest in the unit of Militia Bowmen and had them 2-tapped from infinite range with Call Forth the Deep Violent Geyser. That's not an experience that should exist. Infinite range unit killing attacks shouldn't be present, and now technically they no longer are. If you park that regiment in a piece of terrain and they die, that's on you, buddy. But there is counterplay against it now. Some other changes to Earth stuff, with the major one being that Kiss of the Earth does something. Previously, Kiss of the Earth read, kill one of your own regiments that has 2 or fewer stands. I don't know why that existed. I think the plan was always that they would change that at some point in the future. Now they have. Target enemy regiment has -2 march during its first march or charge action this round. Is that fantastic? Yeah, it's okay. Could be very significant in some cases. Could be very meaningful. But the more important thing is, it does something, as opposed to the previous one, which literally killed your own regiments. Yeah, it made them into... it didn't matter. It killed your own regiments. There is almost never a buff or effect that warrants that, and certainly previous Kiss of the Earth did not. Now it does something. So overall, Sorcerer Kings, how are they doing? Very, very gentle tap to air monsters. Entirely warranted, and frankly, they got off really very lightly. And a removal of the infinite range unconditional offense. That stuff was toxic, it shouldn't have existed. I am very glad to see it gone, but I'm very glad to see Sorcerer Kings remain a faction of terrain manipulation, because like that's their whole fluff. Their whole fluff was that they raised continents and shaped the earth and changed things around them and built this civilization out of the ocean. And so they are a faction that should do cool things with terrain. Now they key around terrain that is already on the table. As noted with Dweghom, there's plenty of terrain on most Conquest boards, and you can play with any terrain on the table. You can do things with the Sorcerer King's spells and rituals and stuff. It's just that you can't create tokens anymore and you don't have infinite range offensive stuff. I think my only concern about the Sorcerer King's update is that, holy damn, Maharabati are stonks. I would keep an eye on these guys. I would be prepared for like TTS events to start seeing the maximum availability of these things appear, because people won't have to worry about models in a TTS event. I would run 5 regiments of Maharabati in a list if I owned them, if I was running even remotely compatible Maharaja courts. So watch out for them. Probably very, very good. Just keep an eye out. Otherwise, very happy with these changes. Alright, up next, Old Dominion, and Parabellum have done me an underkindness by having Old Dominion and Nords at the very end of the document, because there are some big changes to these lads. Actually, I have to pause the video and read ahead a little bit, because there's a lot that's going on here. To start with, Brittle. We covered Brittle at the very beginning. When an Old Dominion regiment is attacked, or animate vessel regiment is attacked in the flank, it turns 2 successful defense rolls into fail, the rear 4. That is not insignificant, although I will note good players playing other factions habitually try to prevent those kind of flank and rear attacks from occurring. There are lots of strategies and tactics that you can use to keep your flanks safe. As a result, I am not personally of the opinion that this is a massive nerf or the end of the world for OD players. I think the first time an Old Dominion player has this rule used against them, they're going to feel quite surprised. But the overall takeaway should still be Old Dominion regiments being attacked in the flank or rear are probably still more durable than other regiments who have an actual resolve stat. It's also very easy for Old Dominion regiments to auto-pass combat reform rolls and get their front oriented toward the enemy. So while the existence of this rule is absolutely a nerf to the faction, because it didn't exist previously and it is only a negative rule, we're going to see a lot of ways to remove the rule from regiments, and good play will keep your regiments safe. In terms of memories of old and the various dark power pools, the significant change here is that you now can't stack memories of old. You get them as an action at tier 1, a draw event at tier 2, and that's it. This is really only meaningful for Praetorian Guard in particular. Praetorian Guard, actually, and Legionnaires. Praetorian Guard and Legionnaires were the 2 regiments that you would habitually see double memories of old. Praetorians to get to defense 5, Legionnaires to get to infinite stands for seizing objectives. That interaction is now gone. However, here we see the first buff to Old Dominion, because Jesus Christ tier 4 got a glow up. You can still only access this through Strategos and Heliarch Warlords, both of whom are good. But let me just stress that there is a colossal difference between what was effectively Deadly Terror before, enemy resolve rolls of 6 cause an additional wound. Now, enemies engaged with a friendly regiment with animate vessel reroll successful morale tests. That is so significant. Now, getting to tier 4 is not easy. It will take you much of the game. Your force will be damaged by the time you get there. This is colossal, however. It will be very possible to build lists built around aggressively pursuing Dark Power Tier 4 to get this benefit online as quickly as possible, and there are ways to get friendly regiments counting as if they're under the effects of Dark Power Tier 4 to get this benefit out there into the army otherwise. This is really strong, and it's the first significant buff that we see. Then we get to the Fallen Pantheon pool. There are a bunch of changes here, mostly keying into keywords. So this is not exactly a rework to Old Dominion, but it's pretty bloody close. because we have the Legion, the Creed, and the Fallen Pantheon as keywords now. All of your regiments will fall into one or more of those. Pretty straightforward. The Creed are like the priests, the Fallen Pantheon worship the additional gods in addition to Haslia, the fallen divinities, etc. And then the Legions are the Legions. And most of what you would expect to have a keyword has the appropriate keyword. The Fallen Divinity now only buffs Fallen Pantheon regiments with the Animate Vessel special rule, but she also lets those Fallen Pantheon regiments activate their Memories of Old as a draw event when she gets to tier 2. So now that Memories of Old, previously that would have been gated behind the Dark Power pool, now some regiments within 12 inches of the Fallen Divinity get the benefit of Memories of Old as a draw event. Then at tier 3, you get the same heal, and I'm also just going to call out something I'm a bit concerned about, and I'm not sure if the devs 100% thought through. They may have, but there are now ways to spend dark power tokens. Now, what I am not sure about is losing the benefits of the previous tier, which we can see here in the Blasphemous Soma rule, and then regaining it. Can you rubber band the Fallen Divinity back and forth between tiers, particularly between 2 and 3, healing her for 6 each time? If you can, that's a really big deal. Now, it may not be easy to do so, but if that's possible, keep an eye on it. Regardless, the other things that now happen are that Fallen Pantheon regiments with Animate Vessel within 12 get +2 attacks. All other friendly regiments within 12 inches get inspired. This is previously something you would have had to have Dark Power Tier 3 come from. And notably, she doesn't nuke her own regiments anymore. Now, that was a rule that was always part of the learning curve for using her, and especially if you were a new player, the 4 wounds to your own regiments that ended action near her was very difficult to manage. It was thematic, it was interesting, it was a pain in the ass. It's now gone. All of the Fallen Pantheon buffs are now purely beneficial, and the Fallen Divinity herself has changed. All of the tiers are a little bit different, and we'll try and break it down. Firstly, now, whenever she is attacked, target of a volley action gains Tenacious 1. If you lost her in the early game, most of the time it was because a particularly good range unit got a beat on her. Tenacious 1 is going to help a little bit. To note, she does not have Brittle. At tier 1, she gains Unstoppable and Brutal Impact. She didn't have those previously. Unstoppable in particular was a little bit of an issue. And she goes to move 6, and she has a massive increase in her wound. Now, she's Defense 3, Evasion 2, and she does not have Hardened at tier 1. Didn't really matter. She was always... Evasion 3 was the big deal. Now she's Defense 3, Evasion 2. That's a reduction in her overall durability at tier 1, except 16 wounds. Now, the wounds characteristic of a divinity is a little bit weird. She is now 16 wounds the entire game, rather than going 12 to 14 to 16. Which means she's much more likely to survive some random unlucky alpha strike against her on tier 1, but she doesn't get those wounds back. She doesn't increase in resiliency as much. She has those 16 wounds to play with the entire game. If she takes damage, effectively her total wound count might be something more like 24, 26, because she gets the heal 4, the heal 6 as she moves up tiers still, and you can potentially rubber band her if those rules work the way I think they do. But even with the change to D3 E2, that's a pretty significant change to her durability in the first tier. She's also fast enough at movement 6 Unstoppable to potentially go after an enemy light regiment, but I would avoid exposing her to too much harm early. You don't want her taking more than at most 4, 5 wounds, because if you take those wounds, the heal as she moves up tiers won't save her. The durability at 16 wounds, though, is probably enough that she could maybe go and fight something like a hunting pack? Maybe? Possibly? Or a raider unit, perhaps? I'm not selling myself on this, but she won't get spiked the hell down like she would if she had 14 wounds. At tier 2, gains Brutal Impact 2, wounds still 16, loses Hardened, defense increases from 4 to 3. So now, at tier 2, she's D4, Evasion 3. Evasion 2, rather. Now, no Hardened anymore means that she's probably about as durable at tier 2 as she was before. A little bit of an asterisk. Historically, tier 2 was when she was most vulnerable, because she's just had any heal from moving up to tier 2. The heal from tier 3 is probably a little while away, and she was only defense 3 with Blessed. Now she's defense 4, but no Hardened, which means that if a big hit gets into her with high cleave, she's probably a little more vulnerable than she was previously. But I think she's able to step more into kind of like the light regiment bully character much more at this stage. At tier 2, I would have no concerns. I would have limited concerns. I'd have some concerns sending her into like a regiment of Flame Berserkers or Inferno Automata. But she should be able to tank her way through and get some kills there. Her offensive damage output at tier 2 is enough that she starts doing some damage. You can probably be a little more ballsy with her. Now at tier 3, Brutal Impact 3 loses Hardened, loses Tenacious, Evasion spikes up to 3. This, I think, is overall a pretty significant reduction in her durability at the highest tier, and that's a pretty big deal. So previously, I've played a lot of Fallen Divinity. Previously, this is how you would play her. At tier 1, you hide like a coward. At tier 2, you hide like a coward. At tier 3, you're a god, go and win the game. Because at tier 3, she had Defense 4, a very high hardened value, Blessed and Tenacious. Most of the time, attacks against her would just not do any damage, because that combination of rules, plus she's an Animate Vessel, doesn't have a resolve stat, just rendered her effectively invulnerable, and she could go and bully the table. There was almost nothing that could bring down a tier 3 Fallen Divinity. Now, she's Defense 4, Evasion 3 with Blessed, and that's pretty durable, but a high number of cleave hits or some AP1, any AP1 shooting in even modest volume that gets past her Tenacious against range attacks starts doing chip damage to her. So I think the kind of goal here is, firstly, she doesn't nuke her own army anymore. So tier 3, she can continue to fight with support, but she's going to need to fight with support, because if she doesn't, actually enemy regiments can genuinely be a threat to her. She's a Blessed regiment, she still loves to take bully fights. Anytime a Blessed regiment is fighting one-on-one against an enemy, it's in a great spot. But I don't think the tier 3 Fallen Divinity is the, cool, I win the game now, as much as she was previously. The only other notable change is that there is an activated portion of her Supremacy ability, which allows her to emergency nuke one of her own regiments. Die fighting from the command stand, the main thing is you get a whole bunch of tokens, which can fling her up a tier. And so you can do things like spend down, spend up, or even just, oh shit, she's going to die, I need to get to tier 3. This can help keep her on the board, albeit at pretty significant cost, because destroying entire stands of your own regiment is something that you would only do if it was absolutely necessary to kind of keep her alive. If I had to guess, I would say she's probably now a lot more new player friendly, because she's more durable early, and in particular, I think she's much more durable at tier 1 to bad luck, and probably more durable at tier 2, and she doesn't nuke her own army at tier 3. I think the heights of her power are lower, but the issue for most players was surviving to reach those heights, which she's better at doing now. Archimandrite gains the Creed and new Supremacy ability. This, I think, is really, really good. So, Blasphemous Mazer draw event. Can spend a Dark Power token. Hey, look, spending Dark Power tokens. That's really cool. To gain a free spellcasting. Now, he used to just get a free spellcasting activation. Now he has to spend. That's a little bit of an issue. But in addition, the whole freaking army gains Aura of Death +1. That's just a value farm. That's just a really big deal. And when you activate a Creed or Legion regiment before doing any draw events, you can spend Dark Power to get either Dark Power 1 or Lose Brittle or Terrifying +1. All of these collectively are good. Yes, having to pay Dark Power to get your free spellcasting, that's a big deal. But the whole army gains Aura of Death +1. In another year, that would have just been a supremacy by itself. In the right list, that just does so much damage over time. And it's just a third of the overall supremacy. So really solid. Archimandrite as a warlord, I would have no concerns, except that there's plenty of competition. Hero Deacon, Fallen Pantheon. It can be the warlord now. What's it get? It gets a free unconditional spellcasting action. That's pretty neat. There's a lot that a Hero Deacon can do, particularly later in the game when you've got plenty of dark power. Doing things like blessing a brute regiment and casting an offensive spell, that's really nice. Also, every friendly regiment loses brittle. There you go. If you didn't like brittle as a rule, if you hate it, you can just not have it on your entire army. In addition, when you perform Dark Shepherd as a draw event, get an extra token. Cultists and Hashasins become Fallen Pantheon, and then activated, every Fallen Pantheon regiment gets blessed until the end of the round. To note, Canophores have changed significantly and have lost Blessed, so this is a way of giving it back and giving it to the entire army. I don't know if I would take this guy necessarily. I mean, he's perfectly appealing, and especially if you hate Brittle, he might be a go-to. But with the Fallen Pantheon thing, he's a little bit of a build around, so just something to be aware of. Strategos, this guy's a banger. He got nerfed to absolute shit, and it got called a buff like 3 or 4 patch cycles ago. He's back, baby. Firstly, he lets you reach Dark Power Tier 4. Dark Power Tier 4 is really, really good. Secondly, every Supremacy phase, pick one of the following. 2 friendly Legion regiments, they gain one of the following benefits until the end of the round. Counts as Dark Power Tier +1, or activates Memories of Old ability immediately. That's really good on things like Praetorians. Those Praetorians, Bastion is up now before anything activates. That's excellent. Rolls 2d6 and picks the highest intervening charge distance, or regiment loses brittle. You can pick 2 regiments to lose brittle here. You would occasionally pick one. If there's a regiment that's like, it's getting attacked in the flank, I can't stop that. Cool, emergency brittle off. I think the main thing is auto-activating Memories of Old ability on things like Athanati and the Praetorians before they have to activate, and the 2d6 charge, and of course, reaching Dark Power Tier 4 is excellent. Mounted Strategos, much of the same. His Supremacy. Can reach Dark Power Tier 4 once per round when performing a charge or clash with a Legion regiment. Before rolling to hit, you can declare the use of this ability, so it's effectively activated once per round, except that if he dies, it stays around. They convert 1 plus X failed hits into successes until the end of the action. Again, this is on charges or clashes. The highest value use of this is probably going to be either on Varangians, where it's a very big deal, or Cataphractoid charges, where it's a very big deal, to get anything from 2 to 5 misses turned into hits. That's really good. It's once per round. That's really good. It also isn't particularly difficult to build around because it's really easy to build an all Legion list. And then, until the end of the round, so once per game, the regiment that you pick to do this also counts as under Dark Power Tier 4. As a reminder, that is Inspired and Memories of Old as a draw event, and enemies reroll their successful resolve rolls. Now, historically, counting as under Dark Power Tier 4 will not let you, if you're, say, Dark Power Tier 2, turn these into five failed hits into successes, because synthetic dark power, for lack of a better term, has always consistently been ruled as not interacting with things that count as under or require the actual tier of the dark power pool. But it does make enemies engage with you reroll successful resolve rolls, and if you're going a charge with cataphracts and they're turning, say, your Dark Power Tier 2, and they're turning 3 failed misses into hits on their charge, and they're rerolling successful resolve rolls, that's a huge blowout attack. Alright, Theocrator. Here's Creed. Gains Terrifying. Did he not have Terrifying? He's an animate vessel. He had Terrifying. I'm not sure what the deal is here. Loses Trample. That's pretty significant. Gains Carez as restricted. I like Carez a lot. That's pretty good. I see. So, boom, Exploitation of Divine Vanity. Now, loses the wounds, generates Dark Power token, and Aura of Death +10. So boom, there's your hits. It's Aura of Death rather than Trample. That is a nerf, but the Theocrator was very powerful. He's also got a pretty interesting supremacy. I don't personally think this is particularly good, but it is interesting. Creed and Legion regiments with Animate Vessel gain Terrifying +1 as an additional benefit of Dark Power Tier 3. Now that's good, but you have to build towards it. Once per round before performing a clash, you can spend a power token to grant Trial of Will, and then as an activated ability, everyone gains it. Trial of Will, I don't know how good it is yet. If you're at Tier 3, getting Terrifying +1, it's probably pretty strong. Much of the time, regiments generally have resolve that is like 1 or more points higher than their defense, which means that Trial of Will, where your enemy uses their resolve statistic rather than their defense statistic to make defense rolls, doesn't do particularly much. If you time this correctly, if you get heavily engaged, you're engaged across a broad front, lots of things are fighting, and you get to Tier 3 and you pop this, then it's really good, because then everything is Terra 2, and at that point, Trial of Will does a lot of damage, because you effectively have, like, all of your Athanati are running at, okay, sure, the enemy are resolve higher than defense, but then they're Terra 2, and that Terra 2 applies on the resolve rolls, so you really need to work toward Reign of Terror popping off. But if you get a good Reign of Terror turn, if everything builds toward that, gives you a really significant crescendo. Don't know if I would take him over, like, the Strategos stuff. I really like how the Strategos Warlords work. I like the Archimandrite. I like the Hero Deacon. But he is interesting. Heliarch, Legion, Battlefield, blah blah blah, still has all of his very powerful offensive tools and gains double time draw event on the regiment that he's on. His supremacy changed significantly, and this is one of those ones, the devs note this, arguably the strongest warlord in the game. I would argue that he was not the strongest warlord in the game, but he was very strong. And so now he does something completely different. Always active, can get to Dark Power Tier 4. Dark Power Tier 4 is excellent. Friendly Legion Mediums gain Vanguard 2. Friendly Medium Heavies gain Vanguard 4. I like that as a passive, because there's the really nice thing that happens where, like, just giving your heavies the ability to catch up with your battle line lets you do things like run additional heavies. It's just a really nice quality of life, and it's not the only thing that he does. Dark Power Tier 4, and then once per round, choose one. When a Legion declares a charge, add X to its charge distance where X is your Dark Power pool, so you might, for example, have Cataphractoi with +4 charge distance. When the regiment your warlord is attached to declares a clash characteristic, or your warlord declares a duel, add X to the character's attack characteristic where X is your Dark Power pool. So most of the time, once you'll be getting a charge bonus. Charge bonus of 1, 2, 3, or 4 inches once per round. That's just a nice to have. That can be transformative in some cases. Varangians, Athanati, you only need one regiment around to benefit from this for it to be a really big deal. Varangians, Athanati, Cataphractoi getting up to +4 inches of charge distance. That's excellent. I will note this really should be +X inches, but we know what it means. When everything is fully engaged, sure, the Heliarch has a million attacks, fill your boots, murder everything, that's fine. But the main thing here is Vanguard plus ability to really aggressively close. This kind of keeps a lot of his identity intact, right? Where one of the things that the Heliarch, the golden Heliarch turn was charge, clash, clash. You win the game. You just blow everything out. But most of the time, people would keep their distance, so you'd use SRMC to march, charge, clash, and that was really strong. He still has a lot of that gap closing, except that it's across a really long duration. Like the entire game, he has a gap closing advantage now. Don't mind this at all. I think this is competitive with like every other warlord, and that means we've gone through these supremacies. All of these are interesting. Like every one of these supremacy abilities is interesting, and I can think about building a list around. Excellent. One of the best things you can do for army-wide interest, and well, like 100 Kingdoms did this, like way back, the January 2025 rework. Every warlord was interesting. Now, effectively, there were only 4 warlords, but you mix and match. You had 8 total combinations or thereabouts, and all of them were interesting. This does that, and that's really nice. Like, genuinely, really well done here, guys. Okay, moving on as quickly as we can. Bunch of artifact changes. Curious of Haslia's Shadow does various dual shit. Okay, cool. Aventine Armor makes a regiment into Fallen Pantheon. That's nice to have some synergy with either the Heroic Warlord or the Fallen Divinity. A few restrictions on Legion characters only for Imperial Oplon, etc. Armor of the Living Saint gains Creed battlefield role, more importantly, Priest 1. Most of the time in Old Dominion you should be swimming in interference, but if for whatever reason you don't have it, this is a little more of it. Okay, neat. Skofnung, Calamitas still the same. Calamitas still makes the poor spear in city-states look silly. It is strictly better, but that's fine. Factions don't have to be identical. Eleuthera is the same. Soul Reaper. Okay, so this one, last resort weapon. Okay, so here is a potential problem interaction that I mentioned. This is a way that you can spend dark power tokens to gain a bonus to your attack characteristic. Now, I think if we scroll back up, what we'll actually see is there is reference to power tokens, not dark power tokens, and there's a dark power pool and a Fallen Pantheon pool. I think, and it's difficult to kind of tell from this, I don't have the full PDF for Old Dominion in front of me. I hope what that means is that you can only spend tokens from the Dark Power pool, not from the Fallen Pantheon pool. I hope how this is meant to work is that when a model dies, it adds a power token to either Dark Power or Fallen Pantheon. And what that means is that this weapon does not allow you to spend tokens from the Fallen Pantheon pool. If that's the case, it's one of the ways that you could have rubber banded back and forth on a Fallen Divinity, which potentially heals her a fuck ton over the course of a game. I'm going to work on the assumption that it works the way I want it to work, because I can be much more optimistic about that. And I think if we scroll back up, we can see here in Blasphemous Soma, when Supremacy plays, power token to an empowerment pool of your choice. Then when we look at the Fallen Divinity, we actually have empowerment tokens, but either way that is different rules language to dark power tokens. So I don't love that there are 3 different ways to describe these things, or at least 2, power and empowerment, but I'm going to assume that Soul Reaper only lets you spend tokens from the Dark Power pool, in which case, and it's fine, you'll never use this in that case because Heretic and Narcomantrites suck at attacking. Anyway, Harvest of the Fallen, new weapon. Character adds +X to attacks characteristic where X is equal to Dark Power Pool. This is probably worse than Skofnung or Calamitas at 30 points, but it is another weapon. If you're running 2 Heliarchs, this will probably end up on one of them. Unholy Sacrament. Character gains Unholy Sacrament draw event. Spend Dark Power token. Same interaction as before. I hope this is only from the Dark Power pool, not the Fallen Pantheon pool. If that's the case, big thumbs up. Character gains Priest +3 for its first spellcasting action this round. 30 points is fuck ton for that, frankly. Given you are spending tokens and it's only on your first spellcasting action, and lots of spellcasting actions have 2, but it might be fine. Grave Step, jumping over Reaping Crook. Grave Step is really good. It's 10 points, and the regiment the character is attached to gains either March +1 or March +2. That's really good. Just a flat +2 March at tier 3 or tier 4 is colossal, particularly when combined with, like, assuming that this can go, it says the Grim Crypt, I'll just do a quick check. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can put that on a Heliarch or on a Mounted Strategos, and if you can put that on a Mounted Strategos in a Heliarch Warlord army, then at Dark Power tier 4, your Cataphractoi are charging 13 inches plus d6. Now, that's at Dark Power tier 4, that's a long way into the game, they probably charged by then, but just as a point, that's a big threat extension. For 10 points, this is a steal. Kentark, yep, okay. Kentark is pretty similar before, but now it triggers at tier 3. That's weird. Doesn't that give Dark Power? Doesn't that give Inspired? Yeah, this is always Inspired. So 20 points to have always Inspired means at tier 3 your army bypasses Dread, Hindering, etc. Gives back something that was taken away from Old Dominion a little while back. Aura of Malice, same as before, really good. Eternal Discipline, same as before. What we did in Life for Like Eternity, I'm not paying 25 points for this. Gladiator gains Flurry, Deadly Blades, and Parry, same as before. Flurry on a Heliarch, obviously a little bit wasted. Notably, I think you can now, it looks like the restriction on Heliarch and Strategos only is gone, which is kind of funny. Parry is good, Deadly Blades is good. This is occasionally worthwhile. Implacable, same as before, same as before. 10 points, character always dies fighting. There are some characters that's going to be very good on. And also some situational loss of Brittle. 10 points is fine. Mastery of the Dark Art, same as before, same as before. Viaticum, 5 points, this is a nice filler. Hero Deacon, Fallen Pantheon Battlefield role, occasionally useful. It'll turn Legionnaires into Fallen Pantheon, for example. More importantly, Bodyguard special rule, kind of nice if he's going in Cultist. It's 5 points of filler. Okay. Athanity, lose Tenacious 1, gain Tenacious 1 against volleys. Look, they got away with murder, with that being the only change to this regiment, but it is a small nerf. While they lost Tenacious, Hassassin gained it. That's, look, bluntly, that's a little bit of a concern. There is a list that I have seen that is like very aggressive, Fallen Divinity, Hassassins, and everything about that list is basically intact. And now the Hassassins have Tenacious. I am of the opinion that Hassassins were one of the like most undiscovered regiments, and everyone had just crested along, like they've just coasted along on the idea that they were bad for some reason, and that was not correct. Tenacious is one of the single strongest buffs you can give any regiment in the game, and they just gave it to a regiment that was kind of already a little slept on. It probably won't be slept on anymore. If you're not taking Hassassins, you should give it some consideration. Cultists gain the Creed, but no other changes. Karez. Alright, characters can join Karez now. Super nice quality of life. It's actually really good. Like, an Archimandrite in a unit of Karez is very strong. That's just a really good unit. It's really good. It's more expensive, but I would 100% take that over putting him in a unit of Cultist now that I can. They also gained a ranged increase to 14. Fuckers absolutely did not need that, but I'm not going to say no. Legionnaires up 10 points. So this is a pretty significant nerf to Legionnaires, but they were probably the most efficient, like medium scoring regiment in the entire game. Memories of Old is now just +1 stand, and to note you can't double Memories of Old. This means that a Legionnaire regiment has gone from counting as 7 stands for scoring to 4 as an MSU. This is still a fine mainstay, but you will only be taking them occasionally and as cheap scoring regiments, which you were basically doing already. You will get slightly less value out of them. They often had insane value before. They're still a cheap light mainstay. Moroi, Aura of Death 1, Translocation can't disengage you out of combat anymore. You can't like move through units, etc. that you were engaged with. You can't like flee out of combat using it. That's fine. Technically they lose being joined by a character stand, but as the developer notes, they're still in a regular regiment. Bone Golems, Aura of Death is now 2, remember that's per stand. Memories of Old +1, so you can get up to Aura of Death 3. Some things can increase that to Aura of Death 4. I can definitely see like a Bone Golem is Supremacy from the Archimandrite, etc. Also, it's not really covered here or anywhere, but Mainstay. So I think they're moving to Mainstay with the Archimandrite, which is really nice. Not that you're struggling too much from Mainstays with the Archimandrite, but that's really good. Becephaloi, lose Tenacious, gain +1 attack. Overall, that's probably a nerf. Tenacious was a really, really useful rule on these guys. And you're not increasing their points, their stand size. They almost always run it as MSU. But there are some things that have a lot of synergy with them now. They're a heavy Fallen Pantheon Brute regiment. They can be given Blessed a number of different ways, including the Hero Deacon Supremacy. So they're probably still fine. Canophores completely changed. They're now a 200-point medium regiment. They've lost Blessed and Hardened, but gained Unstoppable. I assume that their Memories of Old is still Flawless Strikes. This is very difficult. I will have to see this in play. I don't know, and it does say here, this seems like a nerf, but don't be fooled. They're massive value in Fallen Pantheon lists. I'm not 100% on that, but they are a medium Fallen Pantheon unit. There has always been a thing with Old Dominion where you were just swimming in heavy options and you picked the one that you liked the most. So the role differentiation here is really good. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in future they come down to like 190 points or something. But they're still Clash 3, 5 attacks. They get extra attacks from like Fallen Divinity, etc. She doesn't eat them anymore. They cleave 1. So the offensive output and durability is still totally fine. This could be a really solid unit. Caryatids, range reduction, just like many, many other things, probably still solid. Fallen Pantheon now. Kerakis are Fallen Pantheon and Legion with a cost reduction. Probably still bad. Will be interesting to see if this opens up any synergies. I don't know if it does. Centaur Progemoy, Fallen Pantheon and Legion. Cataphractoi. Now, evasion reduced, not a huge deal. Cost increased by 10 points and gained wedge. That is overall pretty okay. That's like 10 points for a wedge is fine, particularly given some of the massive synergies that were added with Cataphractoi. However, to note, Hetarios got nerfed. Just to peer ahead, we can see it here. Hetarios no longer gives rerolls to all impact attacks. Thank fuck for that. It now gives rerolled hit rolls of 6 when performing impact attacks. That is a fine way to spend 10 points if you've got 10 points spare. It's not the single best unit attachment that exists in the entire game anymore. So very happy with that change because they were ridiculously pushed. Hopefully everyone that was going to buy a Hetarios has now bought one so people can meet their sales targets or whatever the reason for that balance change was. And we can go back to Cataphractoi merely being really quite good. As a reminder, there are Warlord abilities that allow you to turn misses directly to hits in large quantities. Cataphractoi will still be able to do a ton of damage, but it's more conditional now. It's now things that go in your army, you build around them, still a very solid unit. Unholy Sepulchre, cheaper, Aura of Death, cool. Profane Reliquary, Aura of Death 1. Now, it should be the case that if you take the Profane Reliquary and then have an Archimandrite Supremacy, you apply those in an order of your choosing. I think they're both things that happen at list construction. So you should be able to give many things in your army Aura of Death 2 in Archimandrite Warlord, and that's really good. That's just solid. That's just cool. You can have an Aura of Death themed Archimandrite army. People will hate it. I will like it. Dark Cenotaph, Memories of Old as a... When you get to tier 2, you can start adding Dark Power to rush to tier 3. This is probably bad. The model, however, is sweet. Dark Supplication, still the same. Black Flame Coruscation, still the same. Black Sun, still the same. Undying Devotion, still the same. Also gives Fallen Pantheon Battlefield roll. Unholy Baptism, still the same. Blasphemous Power, still the same, but Regiment gains the Creed Battlefield roll. Hazlius Touch, not quite the same. Heals the same against Creed and Legion, heals less on non-Creed, non-Legion. That's particularly relevant because you can still use it to heal the Fallen Divinity, but now it will generally just heal 1 wound to the Fallen Divinity. That's less than 2, so kind of worth noting. Dark Immolation, these are marked as changes, but I am pretty sure... Oh, yeah, it's just a range change. Gains the Creed Aura of Death +1. This can push a regiment, like any regiment that has a Profane Reliquary in an Archimandrite Warlord, up to Aura of Death 3. That's quite a lot if you're like 5 wide. That's good old-fashioned 15 hits. Remember that? Remember Aura of Death dealing that much damage? Welcome back. Insanity is now lowest modified resolve characteristic. To note, Terror won't apply here. Terror is Regiments suffer a penalty to their resolve against on morale rolls, resolve rolls, or morale rolls against attacks caused by this regiment. It doesn't. Terror does not kick in if you're in melee until you get to the resolve step. That's to note. So Insanity, small nerf. However, as a reminder, Karez have had a ranged increase on their ranged attack, and characters can join them, so they're still bangers. Drain Wheel the same. Translocation can't leave melee anymore. Immolation, cool. Moroi spell can take the regiment to Aura of Death 2 or Aura of Death 3 in an Archimandrake Warlord list. It's just more, remember, Aura of Death, everyone, welcome back, which I'm totally fine with. So, overall appraisal, there's a few things in here that I can nitpick about, but here's the big walkaway. Brittle, not a big deal. You will learn to play around it, and there are entire abilities that remove it from the faction. Big takeaway, you have so many interesting and viable warlords in Old Dominion right now. Like, I don't own Old Dominion anymore, but if I did, I would be dizzy with different list options. This is a ton of stuff that you can play with and think about. There are multiple different archetypes that are available. If you're an Old Dominion player and you are upset or concerned or feel like your faction got nerfed, you're a curmudgeon. Stop it. This is really exciting and really interesting, and those warlord abilities are really promising. So this is fantastic. Some fantastic, just really interesting and promising stuff here. Big thumbs up. And let's move on to the other faction that also got really big changes, which is Nords. All right, Ice, Flesh, and Blood. You get inspired when charging through hindering. You ignore hindering. The whole army ignores hindering. Cool. Okay, that's nice. Well, sorry. Gains inspired. Impact attacks can still be lost. That's still good. Prophecy unfulfilled. When an enemy regiment is engaged, +2 charge distance. Unconditional, relatively easy to use. Yeah, okay, cool. Neither of these are outstanding army-wide abilities, but now Tribal Tactics. Tribal Tactics, here's the short version. Your army has a second supremacy. Your army rule is a supremacy. Okay. Friendly, mortal, and exalted regiments and characters are affected by Tribal Tactics. Once per game, at the end of supremacy phase, select a single Tribal Tactic. Its benefits last until the end of the round. This is Mortals and Exalted gain Relentless Blows, Mortals and Exalted gain Tenacious 1, Mortals and like most of your army gains Tenacious 1 or Relentless Blows, or charge stuff. Charging flanks or rear count as rolling a 4, so Pseudo Juggernaut, you can choose to gain Mini Juggernaut, and when attacking flank or rear gains Flurry, or Opportunist when declaring a volley. I'm not sure why it wasn't just gains Opportunity. Oh, it's because charging. If you charge, you gain Flurry. Now, this one is most conditional, getting a bunch, like if you have a bunch of flank shots on, like flank attacks set up, you might use this, but really it's once per game, most of your army gains Relentless Blows, or once per game, most of your army gains Tenacious +1. That's awesome. That's a supremacy. Like that's a halfway decent activated supremacy ability, and it is your army special rule in addition to these things. So it's an element of choice. It's cool. You'll usually pick one of those first two, but you get to pick one of those first two once per game. That's pretty neat. Let's have a look at supremacies. Ruler of Mannheim. So this is the Konungur. He can use Tribal Tactics every supremacy phase, but you can't choose the same Tribal Tactics as the previous round. Most of the time, that means you'll alternate back and forward between Tenacious and Relentless Blows. Okay, that's just really good. Every other turn, your army against Relentless Blows. Every other turn, your army against Tenacious 1. That's a pretty good supremacy. Friendly Mortal and Exalted regiments can't be shattered. That's pretty minor. And then activated all friendly regiments and characters, that is to say, Giants and Half-Bloods, get the benefit of the Tribal Tactics until the end of the round. Now, it does say all friendly regiments and characters are affected by all Tribal Tactics. I am not actually sure if that means that you get all three of them on everything that round. I think that's meant to be once per game, your Half-Bloods and your Giants get the benefit of whatever you pick, but it might be worth just getting some clarity, because if it is Relentless Blows and Tenacious to the entire army for a round, that's pretty good, but I don't know how that would interact, because then next turn you wouldn't be able to choose one, because you picked all three the previous round. So that's a little weird. My assumption is it's you get whatever you chose. That's still quite good. Okay, neat. Ruler of Mannheim kind of works. He pulls all the Nords together. Driven by Carnage. It doesn't actually say, but I assume this is the Blooded. Friendly Half-Blood regiments heal 1 wound for every enemy stand destroyed by clash actions and impacts. This is after morale tests. After the regiment this character is attached to destroys an enemy regiment, it can perform an out-of-sequence reform or combat reform. Okay, that's fine. Activated until the end of the round, friendly Half-Bloods destroy an enemy regiment with clash or impact. It can perform an out-of-sequence reform, and until the end of the round, double any healing from Driven by Carnage. I don't think I love this one because you have to build around it in a really big way, and the payoff isn't massive. Like, you can have a big turn where this does a lot, but most of the time, like, the best case scenario often from a clash is that maybe you destroy 2 or 3 stands, which on the active turn, that heals 4 or 6 wounds. That's pretty good. But you have to be in a position where it's very conditional. You have to be in a situation where you benefit from that. You have to be heavily engaged, etc. I'm willing to have the jury still out on this one, but I think this one's probably a bit of a swing and a miss. Happily, there's plenty of other good stuff going on. Raid Tactics. This, I believe, is the Jarl. You can use the activated part of Tribal Tactics 3 times during the game, but must select a different tribal tactic each time. So, notably, the Coninger has more flexibility, but then in addition, Mortals and Exalted get +1 to reinforcement rolls. Friendly Mortals and Exalted cannot be shattered. Activated. Friendly Mortal and Exalted regiments gain Fearless, Juggernaut, and Inspired until the end of the round. That's a pretty decent active supremacy. Like, and Inspired until the end of the round, when you get Juggernaut, it's a bit like, oh, well, does my army ignore hindering? Yeah, it does. So, okay, mostly this is activated, gain Juggernaut, and Fearless. But the other benefits are pretty neat. Now, I will kind of note that it doesn't explicitly say how you handle +2 reinforcement rolls on Mortal and Exalted. Historically, what you would do there is you would actually have to put them in a separate pool and then roll them separately. So, for example, my expectation is you can't have a pool that say some Half-Bloods and some Mortals. And then you roll the Mortals, you roll the Half-Bloods, and then you use the Mortal successes to bring the Half-Bloods on. So having bonuses to your reinforcement rolls can be actually a bit of a pain in the ass. You have to kind of build to have the whole army benefit from it so that you don't have weird inflexibility in your reinforcement arrivals. I think that makes this sort of a little bit of an outlier, but having once per game the existing Nord army-wide supremacy, once per game Tenacious, and then once per game Relentless Blows and Juggernaut at the same time, that's pretty okay. It's not like game shattering, but that's interesting. We'll have to see what else is going on in these supremacies before I think that's good or not. Skyrold. This is the Shaman. Always active. The character and the regiment they're attached to ignore water hindering, perilous, and dangerous keywords. Okay. You can use the activated part of this ability twice per game to gain one of its effect. You can't use the same effect twice. Activated. Niflmire. All regiments' barrage range is reduced by half. Holy shit, that's a ball leg. Okay. Threg. Target 1 enemy regiment. Oh god, infinite range. It suffers 5 wounds which can't be reduced or avoided. These don't trigger morale checks. It's once per game. That's fine. You're gonna dome a monster with that. I think I hate that, but it's once per game. It's his supremacy. Snomsthammer. All enemy regiments reduce their march characteristic by 1 and can't reroll dice when determining their charges. Holy shit, that's such a ball leg. I hate this, the idea of playing against it, but that's very good. So once per game, most of the time, like I'm just imagining playing 100 Kingdoms against this. Once per game, -1 march on everything and no unstoppable. And once per game, your trebuchet is range 15, get fucked. Your longbows are range 10. Regiment's barrage range being halved is very close to regiments can't shoot. And if you're playing against an army that has nothing that Niflmire would affect, no worries, you just Hreg something and do 5 wounds to the dome. I think I really like that. I don't think this is grossly overpowered because the supremacy ability much of the time will boil down to deal 5 wounds to something, no resolve rolls, and a turn of -1 march, and now unstoppable. But when Niflmire is good, it's really good. Like imagine playing against a Dweghom gunline and being like, all of your stuff just doesn't get to shoot me this turn because the Fireforged are ranged 7 now. Like, yeah, that's legit. Alright, Wild Beasts. I believe this is the Vargur Lord. Friendly Half-Blood regiments can impact attack when charging through hindering terrain. They call him Mr. Pig, so very good with Golter, obviously. Friendly Half-Blood regiments gain shock until activated. Half-Bloods gain shock until the end of the round. Half-Bloods gain fury until the end of the round. That's really solid. That is a much better always active and activated, I think, than the Blooded. So if you want to run a Half-Bloods list, I would be leaning toward the Vargo Lord. Those are just solid. Once per round, once per game Flurry, once per game Fury. So once per game Shock, once per game Fury. Those are some really powerful charges. And then impacts through hindering. Yep, that. It's very good with Golter, very good with Werewolves, etc. I don't know if it's better than like I would probably still take Skyvold. I'd take a Shaman Supremacy because I'm a troll, but that's quite solid. Divine Protection, this is the Volya. Friendly regiments gain +1 evasion, and activated until the end of the round. So this is strictly a buff, because previously it only gave that first part. The Warlord may target friendly regiments with spellcasting, regardless of range, line of sight, or engagement. Spells with range of self are unaffected. Okay, right, because you used to be able to target anyone who was in an objective zone. Now, it's once per game until end of round, the Warlord only is... Okay, so that's kind of a nerf. But she is still a very good generic. Like, there's so many regiments that are like evasion 1 that go up to evasion 2. She could very easily still be your default, purely for the case of novelty. If I was a Nords player, I would be looking very heavily at the Shaman. Like, she'd probably still be the default, but looking very heavily at the Shaman, looking somewhat heavily at the Coninger, a little bit at the Jarl, and a little bit at and then at the Varga Lord for certain list archetypes. It's not... Old Dominion Warlord's got a much bigger glow up. The choices you have in Old Dominion are very compelling. But as a reminder, Nords got a whole ass Supremacy as their army-wide special rule, whereas Old Dominion, for their troubles, got Brittle. So I think we're in a solid place here with Nords. It's not quite yet. I think all of these could be played. The Half-Blood ones are very build around. Actually, the Exalted and Mortal ones are pretty build around as well. You've got to kind of pick your lane a little bit with Nords, unless you're playing a Shaman or a Volya, and kind of even then. But there is something to like in all of these. All right, Blooded, cost down to 10, down to 100, down by 10 points. Lost forward force, gained slain bigger. This is a nerf. Losing forward force is a really big deal. Getting Ulfhednar and Berserks in the Warband is nice. It's a good use of restricted slots, but overall losing forward force for 10 points, not worthwhile. Jarl gains Slain Bigger. This is the when you're fighting monster regiments in a duel. Nice to have. Good, like, very thematic for Nords. Very small rule. Jotnar, Cedar. All friendly Jotuns gain Fearless when in range of an objective zone. To note, this is not a supremacy, because Jotnar Cedars can't be warlords, because they are subjugated peoples. Friendly Jotun regiments declaring a charge action while within 12 gain Brutal +1 and Impact +2 until the end of the round. I don't think any of that changed, other than to be made always active. He does say small adjustments. Coninger, you hit volley increased, cool, gains Slain Bigger. Shaman gets Mainstay Ulfhednar and Restricted Ice Jotnar. Mainstay Ulfhednar, I think a Shaman had very restricted mainstays from before. Yeah, literally just Raiders. Now they have Ulfhednar as an entire second restricted. That's really nice. And then it's a way to get Ice Jotnar in a list. Previously, I think they were locked behind Coninger, so that's pretty solid. Varga Lord, 10-point reduction. Small wounds characteristic, lost forward force. Yep, okay, fair enough. Overall, a nerf, but 10 points cheaper, losing forward force. Like, lots of forward force gone from Nords. Nords are now going to have to roll their reinforcements like everyone else. If you want a very aggressive reinforcement curve, you play a Jarl. Okay, fair enough. Volya gets restricted Ulfhednar. We'll have to see how they actually look. Regiments, officers, and upgrades. Raven's Messages, 10 points. If during the reinforcement phase at least one of your regiments is engaged, select an additional regiment automatically pass its reinforcement roll. That's probably worthwhile for 10 points. It's maybe worthwhile for 10 points. I think you take this if you're looking to run like multiple giants, for example, because on turn 3, pretty good chance that one of your regiments will be engaged during the reinforcement phase. 10 points for flank on a heavy, totally fine. That's a good upgrade. With the conditions you have to jump through, perfectly reasonable. I would only take this if I was running multiple heavies, because much of the rest of the time it's probably... maybe it's once per game flank late in the game. You want something good to benefit from that. Heralds of the Storm, cost reduction, figurehead of the Naglfar. Tenacious against volleys is now just 2. It's still perfectly fine, although to note you will often have Tenacious from your army-wide if you choose that. Occultist Charm, new tribal treasure, Shaman and Jarl only, not Coninger, and not Volya. Bloody Sacrifice. This is the same as the thing, I think, in the Old Dominion. So 10 points to get +1 March characteristic until the end of its first action. Big differences here. You can put this on actually, it's Shaman and Jarl. So you're not going to be able to see your ass in Trolls and use this. But we know, for example, that Berserks should still be in both of those warbands, and Berserks have an ability that triggers and is very strong when they're below starting strength. That is the actual purpose here of this. This is trigger rage on your Berserks by taking a relatively modest number of wounds and incidentally get +1 March characteristic. That is niche, but very valuable when it comes up. When we get to Berserks in particular, +1 clash, +1 attack if you're at all wounded, worth paying 10 points for that. Taidokol, 40 points, gains hardened. When am I paying 40 points for hardened? Maybe on Huskarls. That's the only time I can think of. Expensive but worth it? Maybe. Very niche. Also, look, honestly, on Valkyries, Hardened plus Blessed is pretty significant. I am skeptical of this points cost. That's a whole stand of these regiments. Massive Frame, cheaper. Mark of the Beast, 5 points. Trigger, Christian Moral Panic. Sorry, I mean to say gains Half-Blood in addition to any other current ones. Cool, yep, nice. That is just a synergy with, there are 2 different warlords that have lots of tags in with Half-Bloods, 5 points, cool. Vidya, cheaper. Bodris the Bloodthirster. When performing a clash or duel, character may suffer up to 3 wounds and add that many to its characteristic until the end of the action. That's not good for 20 points. Okay, Elding, the Sky Piercer, 30 points. The regiment the character is attached to, hey, it's a ranged weapon. The character gains Barrage 5, and some of these characters got a volley increase. With the range X, where X is equal to the barrage range of the regiment your character is attached to. Isn't that nice? You just get the bow of your so Blooded, Jarl, or Coninger. Join a unit of Bow Chosen or Stalkers, gain Barrage 5 with the same range as the regiment that they're in, and the regiment gains Sure Shot. Hey, that's super sweet. 30 points is pretty reasonable price to pay for that. Might even be a little bit expensive, but I think we will absolutely see. You could do a really cool conversion of like a Coninger in Bow Chosen. 30 points seems reasonable there. Lessons of the Jotun War is a once per game tribal tactic. Once per game Relentless Blows, once per game Tenacious, both really solid. You do need to activate the regiment to get that, but like once per game Relentless Blows for 10 points on some of the regiments in this army, totally reasonable. Jotun Shepherd, 5 points on a Shaman, friendly Jotun within 12 game Dominable 2. Yeah, totally fine. Like that's really good in some lists. Cautious Strike, Coninger or Jarl Warlord only. When a friendly Exalted Regiment fails a charge, it may move up to its March characteristic instead of the roll result. That's actually kind of bad. Okay, not really. Like, sometimes that's a really big deal because you want to get onto an objective zone or get out of the way or something. But most of the time when you're failing a charge, you don't want to move that close to the enemy. So I don't know why it's called Cautious Strike. It's almost the opposite of cautious. It's like, you failed the charge, you yeet forward anyway. But if that gets you into an objective zone, sure. I would probably never take this unless I had 10 points spare, but it's kind of interesting. Call of the Hunt, new, 30 points, Half-Blood Warlord only. When selecting a friendly... Okay, so it's 1 extra Half-Blood regiment. This is the Old-Blooded Supremacy. In a list that is building around that, it is fine. I don't love paying for flank, but this is paying for 2 or 3 flanks per game, and for 30 points, that's pretty reasonable. Pack Tactics, 10 points, Vargir Lord. When a friendly cavalry brute or brute half-blood regiment performs a clash against monsters, it gains support. You're not taking regiments in a large enough size. It gains support equal to the regiment's attack characteristic, which is really significant. Okay, all right, it's 10 points. It's specifically counter-tech. You run this very occasionally, and the 4th stand in the regiment, or the 2 stands in the regiment that are not touching the monster, get their full attacks quality. I would only run this very occasionally, but it's exactly designed to only be run occasionally. Vicious Assault, 15 points, regiment character attached to gain Fury. I don't know if 15 points for Fury is worthwhile. It's a pretty, occasional rule, but I could see that being worthwhile sometimes. Bearing in mind, we do have ways to give, Juggernaut in this army, so okay. Written in Bones, 5 points, can't be shattered. Got 5 points spare? Don't take, because Nord Regiment shouldn't be running that large. Promise of Flesh, 10 points. The Half-Blood Regiment you're attached to gains Vanguard. Yeah, 10 points, I could see that. There are Speed 6 Half-Blood Mediums. That gets them 15 inches up the table. That gets them onto certain objectives in the scenario pack on turn 2. Now, there's other ways to accomplish that, like Fenrir, etc. For 10 points, fine. If you've got 10 points, that's perfectly reasonable. All right, Berserks. Cost reduced, 160 points. Only 45 points per stand. Resolve is 5. They gain Rage. That's the +1 Clash, +1 Attack when below starting strength. Savage is only 15 points. Shield Biter is only 5. But the Savage, let's have a quick look. The Savage is the regiment may perform an additional, not free additional, clash action. Okay, so scrolling back up, Berserks. They can't march, charge, clash anymore. Big reduction in threat range. But they're cheaper, they are more durable, and in combat, they can clash twice rather than inspired clash, which means that if you set these guys up, that is a blender regiment. Now, this is the ideal use case, but the ideal circumstance for this regiment, I probably wouldn't, realistically, I probably wouldn't pay for a Savage or for a Shield Biter. Actually, maybe for a Shield Biter. 5 points for a Shield Biter is like pretty tasty. No, actually, 5 points for a Shield Biter is really good. 5 points for a Shield Biter is like better, significantly better than a fucking pimple drone attachment. What are they bloody called? Catabolic node in Spires. 5 points is kind of a steal. I would probably just pay 5 points. To hell with it, just pay 5 points. I think I would. No, stop it. I would always pay for a Shield Biter at 5 points, but assuming that we're paying for a Savage, your ideal case there is that an MSU or regiment, an MSU that's like taken a couple of wounds, can put out 34 attacks at Clash 4 with a double clash. Now, in practice, that's never going to happen. You're not going to be engaged in combat with an enemy and activate and be below starting strength, but still have all 3 of your stats. Like, not going to happen. But on those occasions when it does, that's like the highest damage output in the game per point for a regiment. Now, realistically, and I guess if you ran a big enough regiment, you could make that work. Realistically, I think how I run these is 4, 3 stands. They're very unlikely to shatter with a resolve that high. They've still got Tenacious, pay for the Shield Biter, have fun, find enough regiments. But the enormous threat range is gone. Bow Chosen, cheaper, cool. War Brethren being gone is just in context of the entire tribal tactics change. Yeah, cheaper regiment, cool. Huskarls gain Bastion, Thing is cheaper. Okay, yep, Bastion. So this is where you might see Hardened. You get to Defense 4. Defense 4 Hardened, probably. And they're still untouchable, I believe. So that's pretty durable, actually. Hardened, untouchable, Bastion. That's pretty tough. Probably not taking, but it makes some sense of 40 points hardened. Raiders, Captain reduced to 10 points. Shield reduced. I would take Shield Biters in Raiders. If we jump ahead to the Captain, we can see Regiment can use the Resolve characteristic or friendly character within 18, and Regiment gains Vanguard 4, and can be changed to Medium. That's pretty good for 10 points. Plenty of characters in this army are Resolve 4. The Coninger is, don't know, Cedars are. 10 points for that large of a resolve buff is nice. On the other hand, I love the Shield Biter at 5 points. I really love the Shield Biter. I don't know if it's good on Raiders. They're not a super high quality, like, 5 attacks on 2s with Flurry. But it's 5 points. I don't know, I would give that some consideration. The Captain, however, become medium if we scroll ahead. Captain is become medium, gain really big resolve bonus, gain Vanguard, and you can choose to become medium as well. Definitely something you would do if you're looking for just a cheap bunker to put, say, a Shaman in. Stalkers gain Pathfinders, yep, makes sense. Still Chosen, Thing for 20 points. Shield Biter, definitely take a Shield Biter in Still Chosen, 100 fucking %. Trolls gain Dread because you don't get it from Blooded anymore. Ulfidnar are now 150 points, Resolve 5, 6 attacks rather than 7, Lethal Demise 3 rather than 4, and you get Bodyguard if you have a Shaman. Savage is 15, Shield Biter is 5. Yep, cool. 150 points, decently killy Shaman bunker, and it's a mainstay, or you don't put a Shaman in them, you put them in Raiders. Yep, okay, cool. Ugr have Unstoppable. Savage Retaliation, they lose Shock. Savage Retaliation, if they're charged and not within hindering, they inflict their impact attacks back against the charging regiment. That's funny. Like, it's not particularly good, but it's funny. And gaining Unstoppable on Ugr, that's the main thing. Ugr gaining Unstoppable, that's really nice. Werewolves gain Flurry. Yeah, that's really good. Fenrir Beast Pack. Defense is now 2. I think they are evasion 2. Attacks 5. That's a little bit of a nerf, but there are a lot of blooded things that work with Fenrir. Golter, Points increase. There's tons of things that are like you can build a list that makes so much use of Golter, so I'm not enormously concerned by that. Ice Jotnar, 240 points against Unstoppable. Unstoppable on a Unstoppable is a rule that is just like just put it on regiments that are that expensive. You don't want that regiment to be in a position like here's the thing about Unstoppable. Quick editorial. Unstoppable isn't a regiment that says isn't a rule that says you succeed your charge. It's a rule that says you can take a bit more of a risk. And on any regiment, that creates a more engaging game state. But on very expensive regiments, it's just important to not have to play conservatively with them. Good. Mountain Jotnar. Volley increased to 2, and they gain the Hurl It special rule. When a Mountain Jotnar charges and fails to reach its target, now to declare a charge, you have to be able to have legally succeeded. You perform an out-of-sequence volley action with Barrage 1, aimed shot, so hitting on 3s, counts as being in range but not in effective range, so 1 shot. Instead of rolling for defense, the enemy regiment suffers 1 X wounds where the target's unmodified size. So that is to say, if you charge a infantry regiment, you have a 50-50 chance of doing 1 wound to it because they're size 1. If you charge a Tontor, you have a 50% chance. This is funny. This is a funny rule. You should never be aiming to trigger this. Like maybe if you are actually no, you know what? No, let me walk that back. If you are a long way away from you can kind of treat this. No, okay, let me walk that back. You can kind of treat this as a weirdly risky 13-inch range volley, where you, like, let's say you start your activation, because speed 7 on a Mountain Yacht now, I think. Yeah, so you start your activation 20 inches away, whatever. You move forward 7 to be within 13. You can now legally declare a charge. You then declare a charge, needing to roll a 6 against the enemy regiment, hoping that you roll a 1, move forward, and throw a big rock at, like, the enemy monster. Oh, that's really cool. And if you roll a 6, you have just yeeted across the battlefield into contact with them, done your impact attacks, and are like, oh, Greg the Giant, you idiot. You're going to get flank charged. Everything's going to go horribly wrong. You were not meant to succeed that. That's hilarious. That is so funny. You can... Oh, it's such a risk. So, yeah, this is sometimes a consolation prize on a failed long bomb charge, and sometimes a weird ranged attack where you are desperately hoping not to roll a 6 on a charge you wanted to fail in the hopes of getting a little ranged attack. That's really funny. Mountain Yacht are fine. They're a little expensive. 210 points is costly, but they're a medium. They're a mainstay in some cases. That's very funny, and we absolutely know Greg the Giant is going to succeed a role you wanted him to fail and get killed as a result some other time. Captain we've already discussed, Savage we've already discussed, Scold Scold is the same, Shield Biter with big points reductions. Here we go, Then. So, the Then is available in a few regiments, and effectively is one of the two. Tenacious 1, always, or Relentless Blows, always. You can put that in Huskarls for 25 points, you can put it in Steel Chosen for 20 points. 20 points for Tenacious is a pretty good ability. It's just that sometimes, remember, you count as being under the tribal tactic, and same name rules don't stack. So you can't get to Tenacious 2 by picking the tribal tactic, but that is pretty solid. Blurred Vision now targets a friendly and grants cover. Most of the others, I think, are the same. Yeah, all looks pretty similar. Okay, so this is a less transformative update than Old Dominion. Old Dominion came with boons and banes and big warlord reworks. We kind of have the same here, but it is on a much smaller scale. Is this interesting and exciting? Yes. Were Nords in less of a position, like Old Dominion were in a position where it's like, yes, the Heliarch Warlord is a very, very strong army. What else do you have? This is the 8th time this week you've shown this to class. And then like 2 Australians were playing Fallen Divinity lists and winning games with them. So the shake-up to Old Dominion really warranted. Nords didn't have, there was a lot of like, you could tinker around the edges, but basically every Nord list started with a Warlord, gave +1 evasion, and then kind of just hoped to trade down to victory over the course of the game, and there was some variation. Do I think there'll be more now? Yes. Do I think that these Warlords are all hits? I'm not sure. The nerfs that came to Nords, realistically, are you have, if you want it, way less flank in a Nord list now, which means that they don't actually necessarily arrive faster than anyone else. That's going to take some getting used to for some players. However, your army gained a whole ass supremacy for free in addition to its warlords. It's also a flexible supremacy. That's pretty cool. Yes, it's mortal and exalted regiments. You won't always have that many of those. You do have to build toward it a little bit, but that's pretty cool. I think I have the hardest time here gauging power, but this is an interesting, if nothing else, novelty for Nords is a really big deal. There's certainly a lot here to explore. It's just hard to tell if it's strong or not. But novelty is its own wonderful thing to have. That's part of the purpose of these updates, is to give us more stuff to explore, and certainly there's plenty to explore now in Nords. And last up, the Weavers. And there's a big thing here that says TPT by Stavros. I was told I could do a video about this, and I was told that I could have this on screen. I'm not sure what is TBD by Stavros, but apparently something is TBD by Stavros. So we may see some changes to what is released relative to what is recorded. There is a note, designer notes, we are aware of Weaver's problems. You will have to wait a little while. They want to make sure to cook, basically. They need to cook. That's reasonable. My goodness, Weavers have got some. There are a bunch of issues with Weavers that I could kind of talk to. I won't go on to about them at length here because it's not the purpose of this video. But Weavers need a little bit of work, and okay, the devs are aware. That's good. We do, however, see some changes. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. The Tao Shi, I think most of this is the same. I ain't. Oh no, it's probably not. Okay. At the end of the round supremacy phase, select up to 2. This is not a supremacy ability. Select up to 2 target non-monster friendly regiments within 12 inches of the Tau sheet to each receive one of the following benefits. You may choose different benefit for each of the 2. When target regiment comes the target on any regiment's volley, while within a piece of obscuring, it gains tenacious. Obscuring, that should be cover, I might let them know. Track prey, friendly kern skirmisher gains arcing fire. I think maybe these are the same. Forced blossom, seed marker, it blooms. Okay, no, these are the same. Gift of life binding, mainstay, etc. Here we go. Here's the thing. Okay, restricted. Coil Drake, Crane Guardians, Gallowglass, Wild Heart, Scothrank, Morrowind, Jammer Knights, Scale Dancers, Scanner Hunters. You just get those as your restricted. Furthermore, depending on the character's seasonal court, you may also include a single entry of the following as mainstay. Scale Dancers, Gemred Knights, Morrowind, Scathath. Oh, thank fuck for that. This is something that we could probably see appear on more characters. But just for now, if you're a Weavers player, here you go. You can use some of these regiments a little more because God, it was difficult to fit all of these in. It's just one. It's one. If you're a Court of Winter, you get one Gemra Knight as a mainstay, but then you can take a second as a restricted. Some of the pain of Weaver's list construction goes away here. There are still issues like, oh boy, Scale Dancers. This is a 6-wound brute regiment that has 4 wounds, but that's something, and more to come. Also, some teaser abilities. Boulder Fangs, a medium brute regiment. They always count as belonging to the seasonal court of the current season, and they have a configurable barrage rule. Okay, seems alright. And that's it. That's it for Weavers. Look, the Weavers players that I know will be just happy to receive even this ability. But yeah, okay. Weavers need a bit more time to cook. Yep, that's kind of reasonable. Sucks if you're a Weaver player. There's a lot that really can be done here. The news that stuff is coming is probably good enough at the moment. Hope that most. What's the line? Don't do that. Don't give me hope. Here is a little bit of hope if you're a Weepers player, because yes, the army's in a challenging state. Some things about it are really good. Some things about it are like, wow, Morrowind, like Morrowind are a regiment. They're like, oh, that seems okay. And then you look at their points cost, you're like, that's a mistake, right? They don't cost 60 points a stand. That's just a way worse version of Household Guard. Why are they 60 points a stand? This is your 190 point. You're kidding, right? They don't actually cost that much. Anyway, Weavers in a bit of a state, but they're being looked at. So, how do we feel about this overall? Well, that's like 2.5 hours of talking about it, and my jaw hurts. But I'm pretty optimistic. I have a bunch of opinions that boil down to the last few balance updates have been not the best for the game. They have tended to include big changes to a small number of regiments that then just wildly throw those off kilter. The Euron and Sorcerer Kings in particular have gone through just like cycles of what the fuck levels of dominance and power and etc. And I haven't seen anything that has made me wildly concerned about that in this update. Those changes, and then everyone else kind of being left in a drought, particularly with no update in January, have meant that I have also personally been in a like, please, I need some novelty injected into this game. Everyone has been playing the same lists for months. Spires have been the only source of any novelty for players if you are a Spires player, and even Spires they were released into everyone else knowing everything about how their army works and with fully optimized tournament lists as the default player experience. And so, wow, there are a lot of changes here. Do I know what's good yet? No, not really. If I had to guess, Old Dominion are extremely promising, and the fact that Speaker's Wadrhun almost completely slipped through without any adjustments probably puts them in a very strong position as well. But no, I can't predict what the next meta list will be, and that is exactly the way that I like it. And because of that, I'm optimistic about these changes and really glad to have seen them. As a reminder, big thanks to Parabellum for sending these through just a little bit ahead of the release, a few days probably, maybe less. And I will release this video basically as soon as I'm aware that the Parabellum update has gone live. This will also be followed by an article over on goonhammer.com, who I write for. We will be going through all of this in writing, a little bit more considered, a little bit more written for consumption, a bit less off the cuff. But I needed to go through and actually read everything to get an idea of what I would be saying there. So you can also find an article, may link it in the pinned comment or description below. Otherwise, hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time for more Conquest content.